The icy wind howled through the dark alleys of the city. The damp, cobblestone streets reflected the pale yellow light from the lonely street lamps. In the gray sky, the first snowflakes of the season drifted gently down, vanishing the moment they touched the frozen ground. Church bells echoed faintly in the distance, blending with the Christmas melodies spilling from luxurious storefronts, composing a mournful tune for the bitter winter night. In the numbing cold, Isaiah huddled in a hidden corner of a narrow alley. The 12-year-old boy, with matted brown hair, a dirt-streaked face, and pale, tired blue eyes, shivered in his threadbare coat. The tattered fabric clung to his thin frame, offering little protection from the piercing wind. His feet, nearly frozen in worn-out shoes, peeked out through large holes, the tips of his toes purple from the cold. His stomach growled, making Isaiah wince. He clutched an old cloth bag to his chest, inside which lay a single hard crust of bread from the day before. Closing his eyes, he tried to imagine it as a warm meal, but the thought only made his hunger gnaw at him more fiercely. Just a little something. Just a little food, he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. Laughter echoed from afar, mixed with the muffled chatter of passers-by whose warm breath misted in the cold air. But to Isaiah, all these sounds felt distant and uncaring. He bit his lip, his pale blue eyes glinting with fragile hope. He pushed himself up, his legs trembling under him. I have to try. Just one kind person. One is enough. Isaiah merged into the bustling crowd on the streets. Storefronts were lavishly decorated with wreaths, twinkling string lights, and jolly Santa Claus mannequins smiling warmly from behind the glass. Inside, families gathered around tables, children's laughter echoing in cozy rooms. Isaiah paused in front of a bakery. The smell of freshly baked bread, hot chocolate, and melting butter wafted out, making his stomach clench painfully. Pressing his face against the cold glass, he stared longingly at the fluffy white frosted cakes on display. A staff member inside noticed him, frowned, and quickly stepped outside. Hey, kid, what are you doing here? Get lost. The door slammed shut in front of Isaiah. He stumbled back, his little heart pounding in his chest. Passers-by flowed around him as though he were nothing more than an invisible part of the sidewalk. He walked on, his eyes welling with tears, but he bit his lip hard to stop them from falling. At last, he stopped in front of an upscale boutique. Outside, a massive Christmas tree sparkled with glass baubles and pure white LED lights. The glow from the window cast a pale hue on his gaunt face. Standing near the entrance, a middle-aged woman chatted loudly on her phone. She wore a pristine white fur coat, gold bracelets glittering on her wrists, and polished high heels that clicked against the stone pavement. Her sharp laugh cut through the wintry air. Isaiah hesitated for a moment before mustering the courage to approach her. His voice was small and hesitant. Ma'am, could you spare a little money for food? I'm so hungry. The woman looked down at him, startled. Her heavily made-up eyes narrowed, and her lips curled in disgust. Oh my God! What is this? A filthy child! Isaiah stepped back, his cracked lips trembling. I just need just a little bit. She covered her mouth with a gloved hand and recoiled as if he were contagious. How dare you? Get away from me. Do you think I'd let someone like you dirty my shoes? Around them, people began to glance over. Some shook their heads, others gave faint, disapproving smiles, but no one intervened. The woman smirked and pulled a bill from her handbag. But instead of handing it to Isaiah, she crumpled it and let it fall to the ground. Want money? Pick it up. That's what you deserve. She turned and walked away, the sharp click of her heels echoing into the night, leaving Isaiah frozen in place, surrounded by an uncaring crowd. Isaiah bent down to pick up the crumpled bill, but a gust of wind snatched it away, sending it fluttering across the filthy sidewalk and into a sewer grate. No, he whispered, his voice breaking. He wandered aimlessly, tears streaking his dirty cheeks. He could no longer stop them from falling. The streets grew quieter as the night deepened and the temperature plunged. Turning into a shadowed alley where the light couldn't reach, Isaiah sank to the ground, his back against the cold brick wall, his head resting on his knees. Mama, I'm sorry. I tried so hard. The wind whistled through the gaps between buildings, carrying an unforgiving chill. Isaiah's small hands clutched his thin coat tightly, but the warmth had long since faded. His stomach growled again, twisting in sharp, relentless hunger. In the distance, church bells rang once more, slow and sorrowful. Isaiah closed his eyes, his breaths coming shallow and weak. Snowflakes continued to fall onto his matted hair, forming a fragile white layer. In the stillness of the frigid night, the small boy sat, tiny, alone, and lost. Yet deep within his fragile chest, a faint spark of hope still flickered. I won't give up. I have to survive. With trembling steps, Isaiah walked back into the busy streets. Around him, the wealthy passed by, their laughter and holiday cheer oblivious to the shivering child in their midst. The icy wind cut through his torn clothes like sharp knives, and his little hands clung to his cloth bag as if it were the last fragment of hope he had left. All sounds around him, laughter, distant bells, Christmas songs, blurred into a meaningless hum. His hunger roared again, a gnawing ache deep in his belly. I can't stop. I have to keep going, just a little warmth, just a little food. Isaiah turned into another alley, the shadows swallowing him whole. He searched desperately among discarded trash and broken bottles, his frozen fingers trembling as he rummaged through the filth. Finally, he found a stale crust of bread, hard as stone and stained with grease. He hesitated for a moment, then bit into it, wincing as his teeth ached from the hardness. From the far end of the alley, drunken laughter echoed, and three figures emerged, young men clutching half-empty beer bottles, their eyes bloodshot and their voices slurred. Well, look what we have here. A little rat. Isaiah froze. But before they could harm him, a flashlight's beam cut through the darkness. A security guard shouted from the entrance of the alley, and the men scattered into the night. The guard approached Isaiah. Are you all right, kid? Isaiah nodded but couldn't meet the man's gaze. With a sigh, the guard shook his head and walked away, the light of his flashlight fading into the distance. Isaiah stumbled back into the empty street where snowflakes continued to fall silently. He sat beneath the awning of a closed store, curling into himself as the wind howled around him. Mama, I'm so tired and so cold. The bells rang out again in the distance. Through the frosted glass of a nearby cafe, warm light glowed, a world away from Isaiah's frozen reality. The night pressed on, cruel and unyielding, but within Isaiah's frail chest, his heart still beat, weak but steadfast. I won't give up. I must live. And so, beneath the flickering streetlights and the falling snow, Isaiah's silhouette faded into the white expanse of the endless winter night. The night still blanketed the city like a cold, indifferent shroud. Isaiah walked slowly along the cobblestone streets, his small feet trembling in his worn-out shoes. The distant sound of a clock striking 10 echoed between towering buildings. Upscale restaurants still glowed warmly, casting inviting light onto the icy streets, like distant islands in a frozen ocean. Isaiah's stomach growled again. He paused in front of a small restaurant. Through the fogged-up glass windows, he could see plates piled high with food, golden loaves of bread, and steaming mugs of hot chocolate. Inside, a family laughed together, children his age happily enjoying their dinner. Isaiah tore his gaze away from the scene, took a deep breath, and kept walking. He couldn't stand there any longer. Hunger and cold were beginning to blur his thoughts. At the corner of a street, Isaiah stopped in front of a large bank. The marble steps stretched out cold and unwelcoming onto the sidewalk. He sat down, curling his knees to his chest, desperately trying to find a trace of warmth in his frail body. A sharp gust of wind blew through the alley, making him shiver violently. Footsteps echoed from a distance. A well-dressed man wearing a long gray wool coat walked slowly towards him. He was tall, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair and a black scarf wrapped snugly around his neck. His polished leather shoes clicked distinctly against the stone pavement in the stillness of the night. Isaiah looked up at the man. His pale blue eyes reflected the light from the street lamp, tired and full of silent longing. The man stopped and stared at Isaiah for a long moment before sitting down beside him. How long have you been sitting here, kid? The man's voice was deep and warm, cutting through the freezing air. Isaiah didn't know how to respond. He lowered his head and murmured softly, I'm just resting for a little while, sir. The man sighed. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out a carefully wrapped sandwich and a small bottle of water. He handed them to Isaiah. Eat, kid. You need your strength to make it through tonight. Isaiah's hands trembled as he took the sandwich. He unwrapped the foil carefully, and the smell of cold cuts and cheese hit his nose, making his eyes well up with tears. He took a large bite, tears streaming silently down his grimy cheeks. The night sky was still heavy with falling snowflakes, drifting gently onto the frozen streets. The light from the street lamp illuminated Isaiah's thin face, his pale blue eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. Half the sandwich was already gone, but he ate slowly as though afraid this brief moment of warmth would disappear if he finished too quickly. The man beside him remained calm and steady. He didn't show pity, nor did he seem impatient to leave like so many others. That made Isaiah feel something strange, as though the man truly saw him, not as a shadow or an invisible blemish on the night, but as a person. Isaiah looked up, his watery eyes glistening. You, you're the first person who's talked to me this long. People, they always avoid me, like I'm some kind of pest. His voice wavered, but he continued, I don't want to bother anyone. I'm just hungry. I just want a piece of bread, a warm place to sleep, but it feels like no one cares. The man studied Isaiah quietly, his expression thoughtful and pained. He nodded slowly, his hands clasped together as if deep in reflection. Isaiah, sometimes people fear what they don't understand. You are not the problem. The problem is a society so consumed by glittering distractions and fleeting comforts that they've forgotten the smallest, most precious things. The man paused, his gaze distant, as if recalling a memory long buried. His breath fogged in the cold air as he spoke again, his voice softer this time. I once knew someone like you, Isaiah, a boy with eyes full of hurt, just like yours, but I couldn't save him. Isaiah stared at the man. He could see something broken in his eyes, a wound that hadn't healed, an unspoken regret etched deep into his soul. What happened to him, sir? The man let out a heavy sigh, his voice steady but burdened with sorrow. That boy isn't here anymore, Isaiah. I wasn't there in time. By the time I realized it was too late, he had chosen to leave this world. Silence fell between them, broken only by the wind whistling through the gaps between buildings. Isaiah clutched the sandwich in his trembling hands, his chest aching with an unfamiliar sadness and deep sympathy. I'm scared, sir. I'm scared that one day I'll end up like that too. I'm scared I'll fall asleep in the snow and never wake up again. His small voice trembled in the night air, fragile as frost on a window pane. His frail shoulders shook, not just from the cold, but from the fear gnawing at his little heart. I miss my mom. She always said I was brave. But I don't feel brave anymore. Sometimes I just want to give up. But I'm scared that if I do, no one will remember me. The man swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. A middle-aged man who had weathered the storms of life now felt powerless against the immense burden of a child's sorrow. He placed a firm but gentle hand on Isaiah's shoulder, his warmth grounding the boy in that moment. You're still here, Isaiah. You're still fighting. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen. The man stood, adjusting his scarf. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a bill and a small business card. He placed them in Isaiah's trembling hand, his voice firm yet kind. Take this, Isaiah. Use it to buy food and find a safe place to rest tonight. He knelt down again, meeting Isaiah's eyes with unwavering sincerity. Listen to me, kid. Life isn't easy, and I know you've been given more hardship than any child should bear, but don't let this world extinguish the light inside you. After a brief pause, he added, If you can, come to Starwood Cafe at the corner across the street tomorrow. Look for me. I'll be there. From a distance, a drunken shout broke the stillness. A disheveled man staggered towards them, his breath reeking of alcohol, his bloodshot eyes wild. Hey, what are you two doing here? Give me some money. The man stepped protectively in front of Isaiah, his voice calm but firm. Walk away, friend. We don't want trouble. The drunkard sneered and stepped closer. Trouble? I need money. You think I'm scared of you? He lunged forward, but the man swiftly pushed him back. The drunkard stumbled, cursed under his breath, and staggered away into the shadows. Isaiah trembled, his eyes wide with fear. The man turned back to him, his voice steady and comforting. It's okay, kid. You're safe now. Once again, the man pressed another bill into Isaiah's hand. Take this. Buy something warm and find shelter. You shouldn't be out here tonight. Isaiah clutched the money tightly, his small hands shaking. His eyes shimmered with gratitude. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. The man offered a faint smile, turned, and began walking away. Before disappearing into the night, he looked back 1 last time. Don't forget, Isaiah, Starwood Cafe. I'll be waiting. Isaiah watched the man fade into the snowy night. Clutching the bills in his hand and the remnants of the sandwich, he felt something new blooming inside him, a fragile but unmistakable warmth. The winter night remained cold and relentless, the snow continuing to fall on Isaiah's matted hair. But deep in his chest, a flicker of light now glowed, a light sparked by the kindness of a stranger. I'll go to that cafe. I have to survive. And under the vast, freezing sky, Isaiah walked on, carrying a fragile hope lit by a stranger's compassion. The morning sun crept slowly over the horizon, but its pale winter light was powerless against the biting cold that still gripped the city. Wisps of mist rose from sewer grates, drifting like ghostly smoke through the air. Commuters hurried along the cobblestone streets, clutching steaming coffee cups, collars pulled tight around their necks, eyes glued to their phone screens. Isaiah sat huddled in a small corner beneath an overpass, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. His small hands clutched a worn cloth bag and the business card given to him by the man named Simon. Simon. His eyes scanned the tiny letters. Simon Grant, Starwood Cafe. The money Simon had given him had bought him a small meal the night before, but the remainder was tucked safely in his bag, a precious treasure. The smell of fresh drifted from a nearby bakery, causing his stomach to growl softly. I have to get to the cafe, but first I need a place to wash up and rest. He stood up, clutching the bag tightly, and began walking slowly. The morning wind was still icy, cutting through his thin coat and making him shiver uncontrollably. As Isaiah turned into a narrow alley, he heard a commotion ahead. Angry shouting was followed by the clattering of metal against the pavement. Isaiah ducked behind a large trash bin, peeking cautiously around the corner. A girl about his age, with short black hair and wearing an oversized coat, was being held by the collar by a street vendor. You little thief! Did you think you could get away? I saw you stuff that bread in your pocket! The girl struggled, her wide eyes flashing with anger and defiance. Let go! I didn't take anything! Isaiah hesitated. He knew he shouldn't get involved, but he also couldn't just stand there and watch. Summoning all his courage, he stepped out from behind the bin and shouted, Please, sir, let her go! She doesn't deserve this! The vendor turned his furious gaze on Isaiah, his eyes narrowing. You're all the same, dirty little thieves! Seizing the opportunity, the girl yanked her collar free and bolted. As she dashed past Isaiah, she grabbed his hand. Run! The two of them sprinted through the labyrinth of narrow alleys, dodging puddles of dirty water and piles of discarded trash. The vendor's angry shouts faded into the distance until all that remained was the sound of their labored breathing. They stopped in an abandoned playground where rusted swings creaked in the breeze and cracked slides sat covered in a thin layer of frost. The girl let go of Isaiah's hand and collapsed onto an old wooden bench, brushing the messy strands of hair out of her face. Thanks, kid, but you didn't have to risk yourself like that. Isaiah stood a few steps away, still clutching his cloth bag. He hesitated before asking softly, Are you okay? Did he hurt you? The girl smirked, her sharp eyes studying him. I've been through worse. You're kind of stupid for stepping out like that, but brave too. I'll give you that. Isaiah's gaze dropped to the ground, his feet shuffling nervously. The girl watched him for a moment before letting out a small laugh. I'm Tasha. What's your name? Isaiah. Tasha nodded, her expression softening slightly. Isaiah, you're not like most street kids. There's something different about you. You're not hardened, not cunning, and maybe just a little bit naive. Isaiah looked up at her, curiosity in his pale blue eyes. Where? Where do you live? Tasha shrugged, leaning back on the bench. Wherever I can. An abandoned warehouse under a bridge, or just a quiet corner of the street where no one notices me. Isaiah lowered his head, his small hands tightening around the strap of his bag. Me too. Tasha studied him again, her dark eyes glinting with something unreadable before she stood up, a mischievous spark in her gaze. Hey, Isaiah, want me to teach you a few tricks to survive out here? Tasha led Isaiah through narrow streets and hidden corners of the city. She showed him how to search trash bins near grocery stores for food that was still edible, how to sneak into abandoned buildings for shelter, and how to read people, to know who could be trusted and who should be avoided. Always look into their eyes, Isaiah. If there's even a flicker of hesitation or sympathy, they might help you. But if their eyes are cold as ice, stay far away. Isaiah listened intently, absorbing every word Tasha said. There was something about her, a confidence and resilience that he couldn't help but admire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in hues of gold and purple, the two children sat on the steps of an old stone building. Tasha pulled a stale piece of bread from her pocket, broke it in half, and handed a piece to Isaiah. Here, share this with me. It's going to be a long night. Isaiah accepted it, a faint smile forming on his chapped lips. Thank you, Tasha. They ate in silence, the fading sunlight highlighting the traces of hardship etched onto their young faces. After a while, Tasha spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Isaiah, if you ever get the chance to leave this life, don't waste it. Promise me. Isaiah nodded, his mind drifting to the image of Simon and the Starwood Cafe. I promise. As the night settled over the city, two fragile figures sat side by side on the cold stone steps, sharing not just a meal, but also an unspoken understanding, a connection forged in survival and fleeting moments of kindness. Isaiah clutched the business card in his pocket, feeling its edges press into his palm. Somewhere out there, a warm cafe and a man with kind eyes were waiting for him. For now, that small spark of hope was enough to keep him moving forward. The sun dipped slowly below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple across the winter sky. The city was swallowed by the growing darkness as streetlights flickered to life, casting pale yellow glows onto the wet, slushy pavement. People hurried along the streets, each lost in their own little world, too busy to notice anything or anyone outside their immediate focus. Isaiah and Tasha sat on the stone steps of an old building, quietly watching the stream of people pass by. Each person carried their own story, their own struggles, but none paused to notice the two frail children shivering in their thin coats. Tasha held a stale piece of bread, carefully breaking it in two before offering half to Isaiah. Eat, Isaiah. I'm full. Isaiah looked at Tasha, worry etched on his face, but he still accepted the bread. You need to eat too, Tasha. I don't want. Quiet. Don't make me regret sharing with you. Tasha smirked, but her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. A cold breeze swept through the narrow gaps between buildings, making both children shiver. Tasha's gaze drifted across the street to where a small cafe sat tucked in a quiet corner. Starwood Cafe, the place Simon had told Isaiah to meet him. Hey, Isaiah. Do you really think that man wants to help you, or was he just saying that to get rid of you? Isaiah looked down at the crumpled piece of bread in his hands. I think he meant it. He gave me money, and he said I could find him at that cafe. Tasha sighed, leaning her head back against the cold stone and closing her eyes. I hope you're right, kid, but don't put too much trust in adults. They're good at making promises. Night had fully descended, and shadows stretched long across the alleyways. As Isaiah and Tasha searched for a warmer place to rest, they spotted a familiar figure standing near Starwood Cafe. It was Simon. He was talking to an older woman, holding a brown leather briefcase in one hand. Look, Isaiah, it's him! Tasha pointed excitedly. Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest. He clutched his worn cloth bag tightly, his feet frozen in place as if torn between hope and fear. Come on, kid. This is your chance, Tasha urged him. But as they prepared to step forward, Tasha's sharp eyes locked onto the leather briefcase Simon was holding. Her street-hardened instincts kicked in immediately. Isaiah, do you see that briefcase? There's probably a lot of money in there. Isaiah's eyes widened. Tasha, you can't. He's a good man. He helped me. Tasha raised an eyebrow, her expression sharp and calculating. Isaiah, you're too naive. Adults don't do anything without a reason. We could take that briefcase and disappear. With the money inside, we'd never have to starve or freeze again. Isaiah shook his head firmly, his voice trembling with emotion. No, Tasha. I can't do that. He trusted me. He gave me hope. Tasha smirked, though there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Without another word, she stepped out of the shadows and began walking confidently towards Simon. Isaiah watched her, his chest tight with anxiety. His small hands clutched his bag so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He could run away now, follow Tasha into the shadows, but Simon's voice echoed in his mind. Don't let this world extinguish the light inside you. Suddenly, Isaiah bolted from his hiding spot and shouted, Tasha, don't do it. Simon turned sharply at the sound, his expression startled. Tasha froze mid-step, her eyes wide with shock and frustration as she turned to face Isaiah. Isaiah, what are you doing? You're ruining everything. Simon looked between the two children, his eyes narrowing in concern. What's going on here? Isaiah stepped closer to Simon, his voice trembling as he spoke. Sir, you have to be careful. Tasha, she wasn't going to hurt you, but she was going to take your briefcase. Tasha took a step back, her face a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. You, you actually did it, Isaiah? You told him? Isaiah's head hung low, tears spilling down his thin, dirty cheeks. I'm sorry, Tasha, but I couldn't let you do it. I couldn't betray his kindness. Simon's gaze softened as he looked at the two children, understanding dawning in his eyes. He nodded slowly and sighed, his voice calm and steady. You've both been through so much. I don't blame either of you. With deliberate care, Simon opened his briefcase, pulled out two large bills, and extended them towards Tasha. Take this, kid, but promise me you won't let desperation push you into doing something you'll regret. Tasha hesitated before snatching the bills from his hand. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she said nothing. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the night, her silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the towering buildings. Isaiah stood frozen, watching her go. His chest ached with a confusing mix of relief, guilt, and sadness. Simon placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. You did the right thing, Isaiah. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Isaiah nodded weakly, tears still streaming down his face. Above them, stars began to dot the cold winter sky, their faint light twinkling in the stillness of the night. Together, Simon and Isaiah walked down the empty street, with their shadows stretching long beneath the soft glow of the street lamps. Behind them, the darkness swallowed the alleys where Tasha now wandered alone. A fork in the road had appeared, and each child had chosen their own path. That evening, heavy clouds hung low over the city, and rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadily transforming into an icy curtain that drenched the streets below. The glow of streetlights warped and blurred through raindrops clinging to glass windows. The sound of water trickling from gutters echoed through the empty alleys. Isaiah sat in a hidden corner of Starwood Cafe. The warm glow of the lights and the rich aroma of coffee enveloped him like a fragile blanket. He trembled inside his thin, rain-soaked coat. In front of him sat a small cup of hot chocolate, steam rising from it, offering a fleeting comfort against the persistent chill. Simon sat across from him. He no longer wore his polished wool coat. Instead, he had on a dark sweater, simple and slightly rumpled. The soft yellow light illuminated the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of years filled with both wisdom and weariness. Drink up, kid. It'll warm you. Simon's voice was gentle, warm, but carried a faint undertone of exhaustion. Isaiah nodded and took a cautious sip. The heat spread through his body, chasing away the icy numbness in his fingertips. Simon studied Isaiah for a long moment before speaking again. Isaiah, have you ever felt like everything around you was falling apart? Like an old building crumbling brick by brick, and there's nothing you can do to stop it? Isaiah looked up at Simon, his pale blue eyes filled with deep, unspoken understanding. Yes, I've felt that way many times. Simon stared into his coffee cup, his hands wrapped tightly around it as if trying to absorb its fleeting warmth. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice low and steady. I'm not a perfect man, Isaiah. I've made mistakes, big ones. But my greatest mistake was trusting someone I never should have. Isaiah's brows furrowed as he leaned in, hanging on to every word. That person is my wife, Amelia, Simon said softly, almost as if saying her name aloud brought him pain. When I met Amelia, she was captivating, intelligent, strong, and charismatic. She made me believe I could do anything. But over time, what started as love became something twisted. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Isaiah gripped his mug tightly, his eyes wide with concern. Recently, my health started to decline. I felt dizzy, nauseous, and weak. At first, I thought it was stress from work, but then I noticed a pattern. It always happened after a meal Amelia prepared for me. Isaiah inhaled sharply, his small chest rising and falling as he processed the words. You mean she's poisoning you? Simon nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow and resignation. I can't prove it, Isaiah, but deep down, I know. Amelia isn't the woman I fell in love with anymore. I believe she's trying to kill me. A shiver ran down Isaiah's spine. He stared at Simon, this strong, composed man now looking so vulnerable, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an unbearable weight. Have you told anyone? The police, maybe? Simon let out a bitter laugh, his eyes clouded with fatigue. Isaiah, do you know how the world of people like me works? Everything revolves around power and money. Amelia is clever. She knows how to hide her tracks, how to make herself look innocent. If I went to the police, they'd dismiss me. No one would believe me. Isaiah lowered his head, his small hands trembling as they gripped the mug. An overwhelming sense of helplessness washed over him. What could he possibly do to help this man? He was just a child, a homeless boy with no power, no voice. What are you going to do now, sir? Simon met Isaiah's gaze, his tired eyes now steady with determination. I can't let Amelia destroy me, Isaiah, but I can't do this alone. I need help, and I need you to help me. The words hit Isaiah like a thunderclap. His mind reeled. How could someone like Simon, wealthy, powerful, and respected, need help from him? He was just a kid, weak and invisible in a world that had cast him aside. But, but I'm just a kid. What can I possibly do? Simon smiled faintly, his expression sincere. Isaiah, you're stronger than you realize. You've survived these cold streets, faced hunger, fear, and cruelty, and you're still here. You're braver than most people I know. I believe in you. I believe you can help me, at least help me uncover the truth. Isaiah stared down at his trembling hands, his heart pounding. Inside him, a storm of fear and compassion raged, but one emotion slowly began to rise above the others: resolve. He looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Simon's steady gaze. I'll help you, I promise. Simon's face softened, a flicker of gratitude breaking through the exhaustion etched into his features. Thank you, Isaiah. You're a remarkable boy. Outside, the rain continued to pour, tapping softly against the cafe windows. The golden light bathed the two figures sitting across from each other. One a wealthy man teetering on the brink of destruction, the other a frail, homeless boy with a heart brimming with courage. Isaiah glanced out the window, a mix of fear and determination welling up in his chest. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, uncertain, but he had made a promise, and Isaiah always kept his promises. Simon rose from his seat, slipping on his coat and preparing to leave. We'll see each other again soon, Isaiah. Be careful. Isaiah watched as Simon stepped out into the night, his silhouette fading into the misty rain. The raindrops continued to fall, glistening under the soft glow of the streetlights. Inside Isaiah, a small fire had been lit, a fire of loyalty, courage, and hope. And as he sat alone in the warm cafe, Isaiah realized something. No matter how difficult the path ahead might be, he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The darkness had swallowed the city whole as Isaiah trudged down the damp cobblestone street. The pale yellow light from street lamps cast faint shadows across his gaunt face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes and his cracked, pale lips. Distant car horns echoed through the rain-soaked night, mingling with the drip-drip sound of water trickling from awnings. The city was alive, yet Isaiah felt like nothing more than a ghost wandering through the crowds. He clutched an old woolen scarf tightly around his neck, his pale blue eyes fixed on Starwood Cafe. Inside, Simon was waiting, the one person who had extended a hand to him in the cruel winter night. But this meeting wasn't just a thank you. Isaiah knew this night carried a weight that would anchor itself to him forever. The Starwood Cafe sat nestled at a quiet corner, its warm light glowing through large glass windows. The heat from the fireplace inside fogged up the glass, and the faint silhouettes of patrons painted a peaceful scene against the bitter cold outside. Isaiah pushed open the heavy wooden door, a small bell above him chiming softly. Warmth washed over him instantly, and he shivered as the cold began to melt away from his soaked clothes. The cafe wasn't crowded. A few people sat scattered in plush red armchairs, sipping coffee and reading quietly. At the far corner, Simon sat in a large armchair. A steaming cup of tea rested on the table in front of him, next to his ever-present brown leather briefcase. When Simon looked up and spotted Isaiah, a faint, weary smile crossed his face. You made it, Isaiah. Come, sit down. Isaiah approached cautiously, his small hands trembling from both the cold and his nerves. He settled into the chair across from Simon, his wide eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. What? What did you want to see me for, sir? Simon took a sip of his tea, his sharp eyes studying Isaiah carefully, as if weighing something heavy in his mind. Isaiah, do you know why I trust you? Isaiah shook his head, his small fingers clutching the edge of his scarf. Because you have something rare in this world: honesty. I saw it in your eyes the night we met, and I believe you can help me. Isaiah's eyes widened, his heart beating fast in his chest. But I'm just a kid. What can I possibly do? Simon offered a faint smile, his voice steady but warm. Sometimes the smallest people can make the biggest difference. I need you, Isaiah. I need your help to uncover the truth. Simon began to tell Isaiah everything: the fear, the meals that left him weak and sick, the dizzy spells, the growing suspicion that his wife Amelia was poisoning him. His voice trembled slightly as he described Amelia's cold stares, the way her gaze had turned into something calculating, something dangerous. Isaiah listened intently, his small hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He couldn't comprehend how someone could harm a person they once claimed to love. So, what do you want me to do, sir? Isaiah asked softly, his voice trembling but resolute. Simon leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant and heavy. I need you to watch her, Isaiah. Follow her. See where she goes, who she meets, what she says. You're clever, and people won't notice a child like you slipping through the cracks. But this will be dangerous. Are you sure you want to do this? Isaiah lowered his head, his mind racing. He thought of Simon, the man who had given him a sandwich on a freezing night, who had listened to his story, who had trusted him. I'll help you, Mr. Simon. I promise. Simon's shoulders seemed to relax slightly, his eyes softening with gratitude. Thank you, Isaiah. You don't know how much this means to me. Isaiah stepped out of Starwood Cafe with his heart pounding in his chest. A flurry of emotions churned inside him: fear, doubt, determination. He knew this wasn't something he could face alone. As he walked back to the makeshift shelter beneath the bridge where he usually slept, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning quickly, he spotted Tasha standing in the dim glow of a street lamp. Her arms crossed over her chest, her sharp eyes locked onto him. You talked to him, didn't you? You're hiding something from me, Isaiah. Isaiah hesitated, but then, realizing he couldn't keep this from her, he told Tasha everything. He recounted Simon's fears, Amelia's suspected poisoning, and the dangerous task Simon had asked him to undertake. Tasha stood silent for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing as she processed the information. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm. This is dangerous, Isaiah. Are you sure you want to do this? Isaiah nodded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his chest. Tasha, he trusts me. I can't turn my back on him. Tasha let out a long sigh, her breath visible in the cold night air. All right, if you're doing this, then I'm doing it too. You're not facing this alone. A faint smile crept onto Isaiah's chapped lips, and his pale blue eyes shimmered with gratitude. He knew that with Tasha by his side, the impossible suddenly felt possible. That night, under the faint glow of flickering streetlights, Isaiah and Tasha huddled together beneath the bridge, their breath misting in the icy air. With a stick, Tasha sketched a rough map of Simon's house and Amelia's usual routes into the dirt. We'll follow her tomorrow morning. You'll hang back while I scout ahead. Stay out of sight, Isaiah. This isn't a game. It's serious. Isaiah nodded, his face solemn. I understand, Tasha. I'll be careful. Above them, the night sky glittered with stars, each one distant yet comforting in its faint glow. Two small figures sat huddled together, their fragile shoulders carrying the weight of a truth far larger than themselves. In that cold, uncertain night, two children had made a promise: to uncover the truth, to stand by each other, and to face whatever dangers lay ahead with unwavering courage. And somewhere in the city, beneath layers of secrets and shadows, the pieces of a dangerous puzzle began to shift into place. Dawn crept slowly over the towering buildings, casting a pale winter light over the gray city. The streets were slick with moisture from last night's rain, and droplets clung stubbornly to awnings, falling intermittently onto the damp cobblestones below. The city felt heavy, cloaked in a silence that seemed to whisper of hidden truths. Isaiah and Tasha stood in the shadow of an empty alleyway, facing the grand estate where Simon and Amelia lived. The wrought iron gates, adorned with intricate patterns, towered above them. Beyond the gates, a sprawling garden lay shrouded in mist, its shapes blurred by the morning haze. Isaiah tightened the old wool scarf around his neck, his pale blue eyes glimmering with anxiety. Beside him, Tasha chewed on a nearly flavorless piece of gum, her sharp eyes scanning every detail of the mansion with predatory focus. Are you sure about this, Isaiah? This place isn't safe. People like her won't let us walk away if we're caught. Isaiah nodded, his small shoulders trembling slightly. I promised Mr. Simon, Tasha, we have to do this. We have to find out what Amelia is hiding. Tasha sighed, her dark brown eyes flicking toward the second floor windows of the mansion. All right, but remember, if something feels wrong, we leave immediately. Isaiah nodded again. With a shared glance, the two children disappeared into the shadows of the narrow alley, blending with the early morning mist. The mansion's kitchen window glowed faintly with warm light. Tasha pointed towards a smaller side gate where the fence was lower and partially hidden by overgrown bushes. They squeezed through the gap, muddying their shoes and scraping their clothes on the thorns. Isaiah tiptoed toward the kitchen window, peering inside cautiously. Warm light spilled over a polished countertop, and at its center stood Amelia. She was tall and slender, her long black hair cascading over her sharp shoulders. Her face, lit softly by the overhead lights, held an expression that Isaiah could only describe as cold and calculating. She stirred something in a porcelain mug, her movements slow and deliberate. Beside her on the counter sat a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. Look, Isaiah, Tasha whispered urgently. That bottle, it doesn't look like a spice or medicine. Something's wrong here. Isaiah swallowed hard, his breath catching in his throat as he watched Amelia pour the contents of the vial into the mug, stirring it gently before a faint smile crept across her face. What? What is she doing? Isaiah whispered, his voice trembling. I don't know, Tasha replied, her voice tight with suspicion, but I'll bet it's nothing good. Amelia picked up the mug and walked gracefully out of the kitchen, her silhouette vanishing into the dimly lit hallway. The kitchen was now empty. Come on, Tasha whispered, tugging Isaiah's sleeve. Let's check the basement. That's where people hide their secrets. At the back of the mansion, they found a small wooden door leading down to the basement. It was slightly ajar, revealing an oppressive darkness within. Are you sure about this? Isaiah hesitated, his voice barely audible in the still morning air. We've come this far, haven't we? Come on, Isaiah, Tasha urged, her voice firm but quiet. Together, they slipped through the narrow opening and descended into the basement. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. Isaiah coughed lightly as they stepped onto the cold stone floor. Tasha pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and switched it on. Its weak beam illuminated dusty wooden shelves lined with old boxes and forgotten trinkets. Shadows danced wildly on the walls as the light flickered across the space. In the far corner of the basement sat a small metal safe, its cold gray surface gleaming faintly under the light. We can't open that, Isaiah said softly, his voice trembling. We don't need to, Tasha replied, pointing to a nearby table cluttered with papers. Look over there. The two children approached cautiously. Spread across the table were several documents carelessly left behind. Tasha's flashlight revealed bold letters on one of the papers. Life insurance policy, beneficiary, Amelia Grant. Isaiah's stomach tightened as he read the words. Tasha exhaled sharply, her eyes wide with realization. Isaiah, if Simon dies, Amelia gets everything. A huge payout. Isaiah gripped the edge of the table, his small hands trembling. We have to show this to Mr. Simon. He needs to know before it's too late. But before they could move, a sound froze them in place. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending the wooden stairs. Who's down there? Amelia's voice cut through the darkness like a knife, cold and sharp. Tasha clicked off the flashlight, plunging them back into darkness. She grabbed Isaiah's arm and pulled him behind a large stack of cardboard boxes. The flickering light of Amelia's oil lantern painted jagged shadows across the basement walls as she stepped onto the stone floor. Amelia moved slowly, her sharp eyes scanning every corner. The faint flicker of the lantern revealed her stern expression, her lips pressed into a thin line. Isaiah held his breath, his small body trembling as he clutched the paper tightly in his hands. Tasha's grip on his arm was firm, her breathing slow and controlled. Amelia paused near the safe, her lantern's glow illuminating the scattered papers on the table. Her brow furrowed slightly, but after a tense moment, she turned and began walking back up the stairs, the sharp sound of her heels clicking against the wooden steps. The two children waited in silence, frozen in place until the door creaked shut above them. Now! Tasha hissed, pulling Isaiah to his feet. They scrambled back to the small basement window, squeezing through one after the other, and ran across the garden as fast as their legs could carry them. They ducked under the low fence, their shoes slipping in the mud before bolting down the narrow alley. Once they were far enough away, Isaiah and Tasha collapsed against a brick wall in a darkened side street, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. What now, Isaiah? Do we have enough proof? Tasha's voice wavered slightly, her earlier confidence shaken. Isaiah held up the crumpled paper, his pale blue eyes wide with determination. We have to get this to Mr. Simon. He has to know what she's planning. Tasha nodded, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. Then we'll go first thing in the morning. We can't waste any more time. As dawn began to break once again over the gray city skyline, the two children huddled together in their usual hiding spot under an old bridge. The document sat between them, heavy with its unspoken implications. Above them, the sky lightened with faint hues of blue and gray, and the chill of the morning air bit at their exposed skin. But despite the cold, a fire burned brightly within both Isaiah and Tasha, a fire of determination, courage, and loyalty. We can do this, Tasha, Isaiah said softly, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. Tasha nodded, her sharp eyes glimmering with resolve. Yes, we can. Simon's counting on us. Together, they sat quietly as the city awoke around them, clutching the damning piece of paper that could change everything. Unbeknownst to them, shadows still lingered behind closed doors, and the path ahead would be fraught with danger. But in that fragile moment, two small figures, bonded by trust and purpose, prepared themselves to confront the looming darkness of Amelia's secrets. Dawn broke slowly over the city, but the pale light of the winter sun did little to chase away the bone-chilling cold. Weak rays pushed through the gray clouds, casting a faint glow over the empty streets still blanketed in morning mist. Isaiah and Tasha leaned against an old brick wall, their breaths forming thin white clouds in the frigid air. In Isaiah's trembling hands were the crumpled documents they had discovered in Amelia's basement the night before. His pale blue eyes shimmered with both fear and determination. Beside him, Tasha chewed on a stale piece of gum, her sharp brown eyes scanning the bustling street ahead. We have to get this to Mr. Simon. He needs to know the truth before it's too late, Isaiah said, his voice trembling slightly. Tasha nodded, her small shoulders shivering beneath her worn coat. We need to move fast. Amelia might realize these papers are missing any moment now. They set off, blending into the growing crowd as the city began to wake up. The streets were growing busier with every passing second, but to the hurrying pedestrians, Isaiah and Tasha were nothing more than two forgotten shadows slipping between groups of people unnoticed. The Starwood Cafe came into view, its warm golden light spilling out through the large glass windows onto the cold pavement. It was an island of peace in the unforgiving winter morning. Isaiah pushed the heavy wooden door open, the familiar chime above the door announcing their arrival. Inside, Simon was seated at his usual corner table. His eyes were sunken, dark circles betraying a sleepless night. His leather briefcase sat beside him, and a steaming cup of tea rested on the table. When he saw Isaiah and Tasha enter, relief flickered across his tired face. Isaiah! Tasha, what happened? Simon stood and pulled out two chairs for them. Isaiah placed the crumpled documents carefully on the table. His voice was small but steady. We found these in the basement of your house, Mr. Simon. You need to see them. Simon unfolded the papers, his hands trembling as he scanned the words. His breath hitched when he saw the bold letters. Life insurance policy, beneficiary, Amelia Grant. Dear God, I suspected, but seeing it in writing, it's like a knife to the heart, Simon whispered, his voice hoarse. Tasha leaned forward, her voice sharp and urgent. If you die, she gets everything. She's planned this, Simon. You need to be careful. Amelia knows what she's doing. Simon nodded slowly, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. His mind was racing, the weight of the revelation pressing heavily on his shoulders. Suddenly, Simon's phone buzzed on the table. The name Amelia flashed across the screen. The air around them seemed to freeze. Simon hesitated for a moment before answering. Simon's speaking. Amelia's voice oozed through the speaker, soft but cold, each word carefully measured. Darling, where are you? I've made breakfast for you. Simon's voice remained steady, though his hand gripped the phone tightly. I'm in a meeting, Amelia. I'll be home later. There was a pause on the other end before Amelia spoke again, her voice dropping into an unsettling calm. Simon, don't do anything foolish. You know that wouldn't end well for you. The line went dead. Simon set the phone down carefully, his face pale. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the screen. She knows. She suspects something. Isaiah clutched the edge of the table, his small chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. What do we do now, Mr. Simon? Simon took a deep breath, steadying himself. We need more proof. This isn't enough to bring her down in court. Isaiah, Tasha, I need your help again. But this time, you must be extremely careful. The three of them leaned closer, their voices hushed as they planned their next move. We'll follow Amelia, Isaiah said, his voice firm despite his fear. We'll see who she meets, where she goes, and what she does. Tasha nodded, her sharp eyes narrowing. I'll find a way into her office. If she's planning something, there will be evidence there. Simon's expression was grave, but his eyes held a flicker of hope. Be careful, both of you. Amelia is dangerous, and she won't hesitate to hurt you if she feels cornered. If anything goes wrong, you run. Do you understand me? Isaiah and Tasha nodded in unison. Despite the fear gnawing at their insides, neither of them would back down now. They had already stepped into this web of danger, and there was no turning back. As evening descended, Isaiah and Tasha stood once more outside the gates of Simon's grand estate. The mansion glowed softly from within, its windows casting golden squares of light onto the dark lawn. Behind one of those windows, Amelia's shadow passed by, a fleeting silhouette of danger. Tasha glanced at Isaiah, her voice low and serious. Isaiah, this is going to be a long night. Are you ready for this? Isaiah swallowed hard, his breath misting in the cold air. I'm ready, Tasha. We have to do this. Mr. Simon is counting on us. With shared determination, the two children slipped through the shadows, their footsteps barely audible against the frozen ground. They moved with the quiet grace of phantoms, their small figures swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Above them, stars twinkled faintly in the icy sky, their light distant yet comforting. And below, two brave souls ventured into the lion's den, their fragile courage burning brightly in the face of the looming shadows. The first piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, but the game was far from over. The night sky draped the city in a heavy curtain of black velvet, dotted with faint stars peeking through layers of thick gray clouds. The stillness was suffocating, and Isaiah could hear his heartbeat pounding in his chest like a drum. He and Tasha crouched behind a thick bush in Simon's garden, their breaths forming fragile white clouds in the freezing air. Light spilled out from the tall windows of the mansion, casting pale golden streaks across the frost-covered grass. Silhouettes moved behind the curtains, one of them unmistakably Amelia's, tall and poised, with an air of chilling authority. Tonight, we have to be more careful than ever, Tasha whispered, her sharp brown eyes locked on the second-floor windows. Amelia's already suspicious, and she could be watching every corner of this house. Isaiah swallowed hard, clutching the frayed scarf around his neck. Tasha, if something feels wrong, we stop immediately. Okay? Tasha smirked, her familiar half-grin flickering across her dirt-streaked face. Don't worry, Isaiah. I'm quick like a cat. But remember, if I signal you, you run. No hesitation. They exchanged a determined nod before slipping deeper into the shadows. Beneath the pale moonlight, their small figures glided across the frostbitten lawn, making their way toward a side entrance near the kitchen. The side door let out a soft click as Tasha expertly picked the lock with a hairpin. Isaiah held his breath, his wide eyes staring into the dark kitchen beyond. The faint scent of lavender and expensive herbs hung in the air, but it couldn't mask the suffocating chill that seemed to permeate every corner of the mansion. Come on, Isaiah. Quietly, Tasha whispered, her steps as light as a cat's paws on the polished wooden floor. They crept down a dim hallway, where faint wall lamps cast elongated shadows across the walls. Tasha led the way, her sharp eyes scanning each closed door. When they reached the door to Amelia's study, Tasha raised a finger to her lips, signaling Isaiah to stay silent. We need to go in here, she said softly, easing the door open. The study was grand and intimidating. Towering bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, and above it hung an oversized portrait of Amelia herself. Her painted eyes seemed to follow them, cold and unblinking. Isaiah hesitated at the threshold, his voice barely audible. "What are we looking for, Tasha?" Tasha darted toward the desk, her nimble fingers pulling open drawers with quiet precision. Anything, papers, letters, a key, something that proves what she's planning. A faint sound echoed from the hallway, the rhythmic click of footsteps on polished wood. Both children froze in place. Isaiah's whisper came out in a panicked rush. "Someone's coming!" Without a word, Tasha grabbed Isaiah's arm and pulled him under the desk. They pressed themselves into the cramped space, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding so loudly it felt like the sound would give them away. The door creaked open, and Amelia stepped inside. Her sharp heels struck the wooden floor with each deliberate step, and a glass of red wine glimmered in her hand. The dim light from the desk lamp illuminated her face, accentuating the cold calculation in her narrowed eyes. "Who's in here?" Amelia's voice was soft but edged with menace. Isaiah and Tasha held their breath, bodies rigid. Amelia moved slowly across the room, her slender fingers trailing across the surface of the desk as though she could feel the faint disturbance left behind by the children. "Am I imagining things? Or has someone been here?" she murmured to herself. After a moment of excruciating silence, Amelia turned on her heel and left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. Isaiah let out a shaky breath, nearly collapsing from relief. Tasha grabbed his arm, her face pale but determined. "We have to get out. Now." But before leaving, Tasha pulled open one final drawer. Her eyes widened as she pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. She flipped through a few pages, her brow furrowed as she scanned the scrawled handwriting. "Isaiah, look at this." Isaiah leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he read. "Appointment with Dr. Mallory, December 15th. Transfer $50,000 to the secret account. Everything must be finished before Christmas." Tasha swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "She's got a plan, Isaiah. And she's not working alone. She's running out of time, and so are we." Isaiah nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We have to show this to Mr. Simon. This is proof." Heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway again, this time faster, more urgent. Isaiah and Tasha exchanged a panicked glance before bolting toward a narrow window at the far end of the room. Tasha climbed out first, slipping through the tight opening and landing on the frost-covered grass below. Isaiah was halfway through when the study door burst open. "Stop right there!" a man's voice barked. Isaiah scrambled, his small hands clutching the window frame as Tasha grabbed his arm and yanked him through. They tumbled onto the ground, their breaths ragged and sharp. Behind them, flashlights flickered in the darkness as shouts rang out. "Run!" Tasha yelled. The two children dashed through the garden, weaving between bushes and trees, their small forms disappearing into the shadows. Shouts and beams of light chased after them, but they didn't stop, not until the distant voices faded into silence. Finally, safe in a narrow alley far from the mansion, Isaiah and Tasha collapsed against a brick wall, their chests heaving. Tasha clutched the leather-bound notebook against her chest, her fingers trembling. "We did it, Isaiah. We have proof. Real proof." Isaiah nodded, his pale blue eyes reflecting exhaustion and fear, but also something else, hope. "We have to get this to Mr. Simon, before it's too late." Above them, the dark sky stretched endlessly, a vast canvas dotted with faint stars. But somewhere in that oppressive darkness, a fragile spark of hope flickered. A light carried by two brave children, determined to expose the shadows lurking behind Amelia's cold, dangerous smile. The gray winter sky hung heavily over the city, the sun hidden behind thick layers of clouds, casting only pale streaks of light over the towering buildings. The icy wind cut through Isaiah and Tasha's thin layers of clothing like invisible blades as they huddled in the narrow alley behind Starwood Cafe. Isaiah sat curled up, his worn wool scarf pulled tightly around his neck, his pale blue eyes glimmering with tension. Beside him, Tasha flipped through the leather-bound notebook they had taken from Amelia's study the night before. The hastily scrawled notes, mysterious appointments, and large wire transfer amounts stared back at them ominously. Appointment with Dr. Mallory, transfer $50,000, everything must be finished before Christmas. Tasha muttered the words under her breath, her brown eyes narrowing with concern. She's planned everything down to the last detail, Isaiah, and she's close to finishing it. Isaiah stared down at the frozen ground, his small shoulders trembling slightly. We have to tell Mr. Simon right away. He needs to know before it's too late. Tasha nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. Let's go. We don't have much time. Starwood Cafe glowed warmly in the pale morning light, the rich scent of coffee drifting out from behind the large glass windows. Isaiah pushed open the door, and the faint chime of the bell overhead announced their arrival. Inside, Simon sat hunched at his usual table in the corner. His face was pale, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. The leather briefcase sat neatly by his side, and a nearly untouched cup of tea rested in front of him. When he saw Isaiah and Tasha, his tired eyes flickered with relief and worry. Isaiah! Tasha! You two look awful. What happened? Simon rose quickly, concern etched across his face. Isaiah placed the leather-bound notebook on the table and pushed it toward Simon. You need to see this, Mr. Simon. It's evidence. We found it in her office. Simon opened the notebook with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the damning words written within. His face grew pale as the weight of the truth sank in. My God. Amelia, he whispered, his voice breaking. I suspected, but seeing it written out like this, it's unbearable. Tasha crossed her arms, her voice sharp and direct. Mr. Simon, she has an appointment with Dr. Mallory tomorrow. I don't know who he is, but he's clearly part of this plan. Simon's tired eyes flickered with recognition. Dr. Mallory is my private physician, and someone Amelia trusts implicitly. He must be helping her cover something up. The cafe door suddenly swung open with a sharp creak, and a cold gust of wind swept through the room. A few delicate snowflakes swirled inside before falling to the floor. Standing in the doorway was Amelia. She wore a pristine white fur coat, her long black hair cascading elegantly over her shoulders. Her sharp, piercing eyes swept over the cafe until they landed on Simon, Isaiah, and Tasha. A slow, chilling smile crept across her crimson-painted lips as she strode towards them. Simon stiffened, fear flickering briefly in his eyes. Isaiah's breath caught and Tasha's fingers twitched slightly as if ready to bolt. Well, well, Amelia said smoothly, her voice like silk over steel. Simon, dear, meeting these children again, I see. They look so pitiful. Simon stood, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. Amelia, why are you here? Have you been following me? Amelia placed a delicate gloved hand on the edge of the tabletop, her manicured nails tapping rhythmically against the polished wood. Oh, Simon, my darling, did you really think I wouldn't keep an eye on you? After all, your life, your everything, is in my hands. Isaiah clenched his fists under the table, his palms damp with cold sweat. Tasha reached over and gave his hand a brief squeeze, signaling him to stay calm. Simon's hands gripped the table tightly, his voice low but firm. Amelia, this has to stop. I won't let you do this to me anymore. Amelia tilted her head slightly, her smile widening. And what are you going to do, Simon? These two children can't save you. They're nothing but pawns in a game far too big for them to understand. She turned her sharp gaze toward Isaiah and Tasha, her eyes cold and calculating. And you two, curiosity can be so very dangerous. Sometimes it leads to consequences you can't escape. Without another word, Amelia turned on her heel and walked out of the cafe, her heels clicking against the floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. The door swung shut behind her, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Simon sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Isaiah and Tasha stared at him, their young faces etched with worry. Mr. Simon, what do we do now? Isaiah asked softly, his voice trembling slightly. Simon lifted his head, his tired eyes now filled with steely resolve. You two need to leave, right now. Go somewhere safe. Amelia knows you're involved now, and she won't hesitate to act. Tasha shook her head defiantly. We can't leave you alone, Mr. Simon. We've come too far to back out now. Simon's voice broke slightly as he spoke, his eyes glistening with gratitude and fear. Please, Isaiah, Tasha, listen to me. If something happens to me, take these documents to the police. Make sure someone sees them. Promise me you'll do that. Isaiah nodded slowly, little tears stinging the corners of his pale blue eyes. We promise, Mr. Simon. The two children slipped out of the cafe and back into the freezing city streets. Snowflakes drifted silently through the air, settling on their hair and shoulders. Streetlights flickered weakly through the foggy haze, casting long, eerie shadows over the empty sidewalks. "We're not leaving him, are we, Tasha?" Isaiah said quietly, his voice resolute despite the fear in his eyes. Tasha gripped his hand tightly, her brown eyes shining with determination. "No, Isaiah, we're not leaving him. We'll find a way to stop her. Amelia won't get away with this." In the distance, Amelia's grand estate loomed like a predator in the dark, its sharp towers and dimly glowing windows watching them silently. Somewhere within those walls, dark plans were still unfolding. But as two small figures disappeared into the misty night, their footsteps quiet but determined, one thing was clear: the game was far from over. The gray winter sky cast a heavy shadow over the city. Fine, misty rain fell steadily, forming a translucent veil over the cobblestone streets. The wind howled through narrow alleys, its icy breath cutting into exposed skin. Isaiah and Tasha huddled together inside an abandoned warehouse, their temporary shelter from the relentless cold. Faint beams of light filtered through cracked and dirty windows, casting thin, ghostly lines across the dusty floor. Isaiah clutched his worn wool scarf tightly against his chest, his pale blue eyes shadowed with fatigue but still glimmering with determination. Beside him, Tasha crouched low, her sharp brown eyes glinting like a cat's in the darkness. "Do you think Mr. Simon is okay?" Isaiah asked, his voice trembling slightly. Tasha exhaled, her small shoulders sagging under the weight of uncertainty. "I don't know, Isaiah, but we have to trust him. There's nothing else we can do right now but wait." Outside, distant car horns echoed through the wet streets, their lights briefly flickering through the dusty glass panes. Suddenly, an old phone buzzed in Isaiah's pocket, the one Simon had given him before they parted ways. Isaiah jumped, his fingers trembling as he pressed the answer button. "Isaiah, it's me, Simon." Simon's voice crackled over the line, rough and heavy, as if he had been through a storm. Isaiah sat up straight, his eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Simon, are you okay? Where are you?" Simon sighed on the other end of the line. "I'm safe, for now, but I need you two to meet me immediately. There's something important I need to tell you." Isaiah's voice was resolute. "We'll be there right away." Tasha, hearing every word, gave Isaiah a firm nod. "Let's go, Isaiah. We can't leave him waiting." They moved quickly through the damp, narrow streets, the wind biting at their faces as they kept their heads down and their thin coats pulled tightly around them. Finally, they arrived at an old, crumbling building tucked away in an isolated corner of the city. A faint glow emanated from a window on the second floor. Tasha pointed upward. "That's him. Come on, Isaiah." The two children climbed the creaky wooden stairs carefully, every step groaning under their weight. When they reached the door, it creaked open just enough for Simon to peer out, his pale face etched with exhaustion and fear. "Quick inside," he whispered urgently. Inside the small room, a flickering desk lamp illuminated stacks of scattered papers and a rickety old bed piled high with blankets. Simon sank into an old wooden chair, his trembling hands gripping the armrests as he stared at the two children. "Thank you for coming. We don't have much time, so I'll get straight to the point. There are things I've never told anyone before." Simon took a deep breath, his tired eyes staring off into the distance as if watching distant memories replay in front of him. "Amelia, she wasn't always like this. When we first married, she was brilliant, ambitious, and captivating. I loved her, blindly. But money and power, they can twist a person's soul." Isaiah and Tasha remained silent, their small faces locked in rapt attention. "When my company began to grow, I handed Amelia control of our finances and much of the decision-making. I thought it would make her happy. But everything changed. She became controlling, demanding, and when I began to push back, the dizziness, the nausea, the exhaustion, they all started." Simon paused, his shoulders trembling slightly. "At first, I thought I was just sick, but then I realized it only happened after drinking tea or eating meals that Amelia had prepared for me." Tasha's fists clenched, her voice low and sharp. "She's been poisoning you, hasn't she?" Simon nodded, his eyes glistening with restrained tears. "I've been living in fear for months now. But I can't stay silent any longer. You two have helped me so much already, and I know I can trust you." He reached for his leather briefcase, opening it carefully to pull out a stack of documents and a small USB drive. The papers were filled with bank statements, medical records, and transaction histories, all incriminating evidence against Amelia. Everything is here. Every shady transaction, every suspicious appointment, every prescription from Dr. Mallory. I've copied it all onto this USB drive. It's the only way to ensure the truth comes out. Simon handed the USB drive to Isaiah, his frail hand trembling as it passed into the boy's grip. Keep this safe. If something happens to me, if I don't make it through this, take this to the police. Look for Inspector Morgan. He's someone I trust. Isaiah held the USB tightly, his small fingers trembling around it. Mr. Simon, are you going to be okay? Simon's lips pressed into a thin line, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Isaiah, but I'll fight. I promise I'll fight. The sound of distant sirens cut through the cold night air, followed by the sharp glow of headlights flashing against the window. Simon shot up from his chair, panic flooding his face. They found me. You two need to leave, now! Take the USB and run. Tasha grabbed Isaiah's hand, pulling him towards the small window at the back of the room. Isaiah hesitated, his tear-filled eyes locking onto Simon one last time. Promise me you'll be okay, Mr. Simon. Simon forced a weak smile, his tired eyes filled with gratitude. Go, Isaiah. Go, Tasha. Stay safe, and don't let her win. Isaiah and Tasha squeezed through the narrow window, landing hard on the slanted roof below. Behind them, the sound of heavy boots and shouting voices filled the night air. They scrambled down and disappeared into the labyrinthine alleys below, their shadows swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Under the pale glow of a thin moon veiled by clouds, Isaiah and Tasha huddled together in a narrow alley. Isaiah clutched the USB drive tightly in his hand, his pale blue eyes filled with raw determination. We can't let her win, Tasha. We have to save Mr. Simon. Tasha squeezed his hand tightly, her brown eyes shining fiercely in the dim light. We will, Isaiah. We're not giving up. Not now. Far in the distance, Amelia's mansion loomed like a silent predator, its sharp towers slicing through the foggy sky. Somewhere inside those cold walls, secrets still festered and plans were still being set in motion. But in that quiet, fragile moment, two brave children carried the key to the truth and the fragile hope of justice into the night. The night wind howled through the narrow alleys of the city, biting into exposed skin with icy fangs. In the distance, police sirens wailed, their red and blue lights flashing against crumbling brick walls. Isaiah and Tasha crouched behind an overflowing dumpster, their breaths forming white clouds in the freezing air. Isaiah clutched the USB drive tightly in his trembling hand, his palm damp with sweat. He glanced over at Tasha, her dirt-streaked face set with determination, her brown eyes sharp and focused. We need to move, Isaiah. If they find us, it's over. Tasha's whisper cut through the cold silence. Isaiah nodded, fear flickering in his pale blue eyes. We need somewhere safe to check what's on this USB. Mr. Simon risked everything to give it to us. With that, the two children bolted from their hiding spot, dashing down the dark alley. Their footsteps echoed against the damp pavement, and behind them, faint beams of flashlights swept across the walls. They stopped in front of an abandoned building, hidden behind a row of darkened storefronts. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and cracks snaked across the crumbling walls. Tasha pulled Isaiah through a shattered window, shards of glass glittering under the pale moonlight. Inside, the air was damp and stale, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Tasha flicked on her small flashlight, its faint beam illuminating piles of debris and discarded wood. This will do for now. No one's going to look for us here, Tasha said, her voice shaky from exhaustion. Isaiah sank onto the cold, dirty floor, pulling the USB drive from his pocket. He looked up at Tasha, his eyes filled with uncertainty. We have to see what's on this drive. Otherwise, everything Mr. Simon did, it'll mean nothing. Tasha nodded and pulled an old, battered laptop from her backpack, a relic she had borrowed from an abandoned electronics store. She opened it, and the weak glow of the screen lit up their faces. With trembling fingers, Tasha plugged in the USB drive. A soft ding echoed in the silence as the laptop recognized it. A list of folders appeared on the screen. Financial records. Dr. Mallory. Amelia's plan. Isaiah, look at this. These files, they could be everything we need. Tasha whispered, her voice sharp with urgency. Isaiah pointed at the folder labeled Dr. Mallory. Open that one. Mr. Simon said Dr. Mallory was important. Tasha clicked, and a series of documents and audio files appeared. She selected one of the audio recordings, and a chilling voice crackled through the speakers. Amelia's voice, smooth and venomous. "You're certain this dosage will weaken Simon gradually, yes? I don't want any mistakes." A second voice, gruff and uneasy, responded, "Mrs. Amelia, with the current dosage, it won't cause sudden death. It'll look like a natural illness. But if this continues, Mr. Simon won't survive the month." Isaiah's knuckles turned white as he clutched his scarf. His voice trembled with barely contained emotion. She really wants him dead. Tasha's grip on the mouse tightened, her brown eyes brimming with anger. "This is undeniable proof, Isaiah. We have to get this to the police. It's the only way to save Mr. Simon." Before they could eject the USB, a loud crash shattered the silence. A window pane exploded, glass scattering across the floor. Flashlights pierced the darkness, beams sweeping over the room. "Run, Isaiah!" Tasha screamed, slamming the laptop shut and yanking the USB from its port. Isaiah clutched the USB drive tightly against his chest as he scrambled toward the back door. Tasha was right behind him, but a towering figure loomed in their path. A man dressed in black with a scarf covering the lower half of his face. He lunged forward, grabbing Tasha by the arm. She shrieked, twisting and kicking with all her might until her boot connected with his shin. The man cursed, loosening his grip just enough for Tasha to break free. "Go, Isaiah, go!" she cried. They tore through the building, bursting through a side exit and into another alley. Their ragged breaths filled the cold night air, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them. "They're gaining on us, Tasha," Isaiah gasped, clutching the USB so tightly his knuckles turned white. Up ahead, a rusty iron gate stood partially open. Without hesitation, the two children squeezed through the narrow gap and shoved it shut behind them. The pursuing footsteps skidded to a halt on the other side. A gruff voice called out, chilling and sharp. "You can run, kids, but you can't hide forever. Amelia won't let you escape, not with what you have." The figure's flashlight flickered once before disappearing into the shadows. Isaiah and Tasha collapsed against the brick wall of the narrow alley, their chests heaving with exhaustion. Tasha wiped her face with a trembling hand, her breath still coming in sharp gasps. We got away, at least for now." Tasha's voice wavered as she tried to steady herself. Isaiah stared down at the USB drive in his hand, the small device holding the weight of everything they had fought for. His pale blue eyes burned with determination. "We have to find Inspector Morgan. Mr. Simon said he's the only one we can trust. This USB, it's the key to everything." Tasha looked at him, her expression resolute despite the fear lingering in her eyes. "Then we move now, Isaiah. We don't stop until we find him. We have to finish what Mr. Simon started." The faint moonlight illuminated their small figures as they stood together in the darkened alley. Despite their exhaustion and fear, they shared a look of unshakable resolve. "We won't give up, Tasha. We'll save Mr. Simon, and we'll make Amelia pay for everything she's done." Hand in hand, the two children disappeared into the labyrinthine shadows of the city, carrying with them the fragile hope of justice and the truth clutched tightly in Isaiah's trembling hands. The city lay cloaked in darkness, with only the faint, yellow glow of streetlights reflecting off the slick cobblestones. Towering skyscrapers loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching across narrow alleys filled with tension and danger. In one such alley, Isaiah and Tasha huddled close to a cold brick wall, their breaths forming delicate clouds in the icy air. Isaiah clutched the USB drive tightly in his trembling hand, his fear palpable. Beside him, Tasha's sharp brown eyes scanned the alley for any signs of movement. "We have to get to Inspector Morgan, Isaiah. Things are getting way too dangerous," Tasha whispered, her voice tight with urgency. Isaiah nodded, his pale blue eyes reflecting the same resolve that had carried them this far. "I know, but how do we even get to him? We can't just walk into the police station and ask for him." Tasha's brow furrowed briefly before a crooked smile tugged at her lips. "No one said this would be easy, but we've come too far to stop now." A distant siren wailed, and beams of flashlight danced across a nearby wall. Startled, the two children pressed deeper into the shadows. "Come on, we need to move before they find us." Tasha pulled Isaiah to his feet, and together, they disappeared into the night. By dawn, Isaiah and Tasha stood across the street from the central police station. The imposing building loomed ahead, its red brick walls and reinforced windows glowing faintly under flickering yellow lights. The brass plaque reading City Police Department gleamed faintly in the pale morning haze. Huddled behind a stone column, Isaiah peered cautiously at the station's entrance. Officers bustled in and out, their uniforms stiff and authoritative. Tasha, do you think he's in there? Isaiah's voice was barely more than a whisper. Tasha's sharp eyes scanned the crowd until they locked onto a man stepping out of the building, a middle-aged officer with graying hair wearing a crisp uniform. His badge gleamed under the weak sunlight, and the name Inspector Morgan was etched into the brass plate on his chest. That's him, Isaiah. That's Inspector Morgan. This is our chance. The two children darted across the street, their footsteps nearly silent on the wet pavement. They stopped just a few feet away from the inspector, their small figures trembling in the cold air. Inspector Morgan, Tasha called out, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Please, we need to talk to you. It's important. Morgan stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing as he took in the sight of the two grimy, exhausted children before him. His sharp eyes softened slightly as he noticed Isaiah clutching something tightly in his hand. Who are you two? What are you doing out here at this hour? We have evidence. We need your help. Mr. Simon Grant is in danger. Isaiah blurted, his voice cracking as tears welled in his tired eyes. Morgan glanced around, his voice dropping to a low murmur. All right, come with me, but be quick and stay quiet. Inside a small office within the police station, Morgan closed the door behind them and gestured for Isaiah and Tasha to sit. The room was cluttered with stacks of papers, a flickering desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Morgan sat down across from them, his gaze steady and serious. Now tell me everything, from the beginning. Isaiah placed the USB drive on the desk, his small hands trembling. Tasha leaned forward, her voice calm but firm as she spoke. Amelia, Simon Grant's wife, has been poisoning him. We found records, messages, and conversations between her and Dr. Mallory. It's all on this USB drive. Morgan inserted the drive into his laptop. Files flickered onto the screen, financial statements, emails, and audio recordings. He clicked on one recording, and Amelia's chilling voice filled the room. Are you certain this dosage won't leave any trace, Mallory? I don't want any mistakes. A male voice, unsteady and hesitant, replied, Mrs. Amelia, at this dosage, it won't be sudden. It'll look like natural illness. But if this continues, Mr. Simon won't survive another month. Morgan's expression darkened as he listened, his jaw tightening. This is damning evidence. If this is real, we can save Simon and bring Amelia to justice. Just then, Morgan's phone rang. The sudden sound shattered the tense silence. He picked it up, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. Inspector Morgan speaking. A smooth, icy voice came through the receiver. Inspector Morgan, I hear you've been speaking with two very troublesome children. I'd advise you not to meddle in matters that don't concern you. Morgan stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the phone. Amelia, your schemes are finished. We have evidence. You can't escape this. A cold laugh crackled through the speaker. Oh, Inspector, you underestimate me. Those children of yours won't make it far, and neither will Simon. The line went dead. Morgan set the phone down, his face ashen with fury and fear. We're out of time. Amelia knows you're here. I'll dispatch a team to protect Simon immediately. He turned to the children, his voice firm but kind. You two need to stay here. You'll be safe at the station. I'll make sure of it. Isaiah's small voice trembled as he spoke. Will Mr. Simon be okay, Inspector? Tasha reached over and squeezed Isaiah's hand, her brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. He has to be, Isaiah. We've done everything we can. Morgan placed a reassuring hand on Isaiah's shoulder. You two have done more than anyone could have asked for. You've been brave beyond your years. Now, let me take care of the rest. As dawn broke over the horizon, faint rays of light pierced through the station's narrow windows. Isaiah gazed out at the awakening city, his breath fogging up the cold glass pane. We've come too far to stop now, Tasha. We can't give up. Tasha leaned against the window beside him, her voice soft but resolute. We won't, Isaiah. No matter what happens, we won't let Amelia win. In the distance, the silhouette of Simon's grand estate loomed against the pale sky, a fortress shrouded in shadows and secrets. Amelia was still there, weaving her dark schemes, but now the net was closing in. Justice was on its way, and two brave children, had become the spark that ignited the fire of truth. Night once again blanketed the city, the pale moonlight barely breaking through thick, ominous clouds. Winter winds howled through narrow alleys, carrying a biting chill deep into every corner. Inside the police station, Isaiah and Tasha sat huddled on an old wooden bench, the precious USB drive tucked securely in Isaiah's coat pocket. Tasha leaned her head against the cold wall, her sharp brown eyes clouded with worry. Isaiah stared out the window, watching the streetlights cast flickering shadows on the wet pavement below. "Do you think Mr. Simon is safe now?" Isaiah whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know, Isaiah, but we have to trust Inspector Morgan. He promised he'd protect him," Tasha replied, her voice tight with unease. The door creaked open, and Inspector Morgan stepped in, his face etched with deep lines of concern. In his hand was a phone, its screen glowing faintly, his eyes locked onto the two children. "I have bad news," Morgan said, his voice grave. "We've lost contact with the team watching Simon's house. Amelia might have discovered them." Isaiah's heart dropped, and Tasha froze, her eyes wide with fear. Morgan continued, "We need to act immediately, but first, I want you both to stay here where it's safe." Tasha's eyebrows knitted together, and a spark of determination lit up her eyes. "No, we can't just sit here and wait. I'm going into that house to find out what's happening." Morgan's voice grew firm, his brow furrowed. "Absolutely not. It's far too dangerous, Tasha. Neither of you should risk your lives." Tasha met Morgan's stern gaze, her voice steady and unyielding. "I've come this far, Inspector. I've risked everything to uncover the truth. I can't turn my back now." Morgan sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right, but promise me this. If things go south, you'll get out immediately. No heroics, understood?" Tasha nodded solemnly. Isaiah grabbed her hand, his voice trembling. "Tasha, are you sure about this?" Tasha squeezed his hand, her lips pressed into a determined line. "I'm sure. Stay here, Isaiah. If I don't come back, you have to give the USB to Morgan." Tasha crept through the darkened city streets, her small frame blending into the shadows like a stray cat. She stopped in front of the grand wrought iron gates of Simon's mansion, the glow from the windows casting long, eerie shadows across the manicured lawn. The gate creaked softly as Tasha climbed over it, landing quietly on the leaf-strewn ground. The wind whispered through skeletal tree branches, and every shadow seemed alive, watching her. "Stay calm, Tasha. You've done this before," she murmured to herself. She slipped through the garden, her movements swift and deliberate. Reaching the study window, she peered inside. The lights were on, but the room was empty. Papers lay scattered across the desk as if someone had left in a hurry. Carefully, Tasha pushed the window open and climbed inside. The air in the study was cold and heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding. On Amelia's ornate desk, a stack of papers lay haphazardly strewn about. Amid the mess, a handwritten letter caught Tasha's eye. The ink was smudged, the handwriting frantic. "Mallory, the plan is at risk. Cancel everything. I'll handle Simon tonight." Tasha's heart pounded in her chest as she whispered under her breath, "They're planning to kill him. Tonight!" She stuffed the letter into her coat pocket and turned to leave, but a voice stopped her cold. "Well, well, a little mouse has crept into my office, hasn't she?" Amelia stood in the doorway, her slender frame draped in an elegant white fur coat. Her sharp eyes gleamed like knives, and her crimson lips curled into a chilling smile. Tasha froze, her breath hitching in her throat. You can't hurt Mr. Simon. We know everything." Tasha stammered, her voice trembling. Amelia laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed in the cavernous study. "Oh, darling, Simon is already a dead man, and you're nothing but a loose end." From her coat pocket, Amelia pulled out a gleaming knife, its blade catching the light. Tasha's eyes widened and she bolted toward the desk, knocking over a stack of heavy books as she darted past Amelia. The older woman staggered briefly, giving Tasha just enough time to leap out of the window and onto the lawn below. The cold night air hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop. She sprinted through the garden, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short gasps. "Stop her! Don't let her get away!" Amelia's voice shrieked behind her. Two figures emerged from the shadows near the gate, but Tasha weaved between bushes and vaulted over a low hedge, disappearing into the night. Isaiah sat on the steps outside the police station, his small frame illuminated by the faint glow of a flickering streetlight. His eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond, his hands trembling in his lap. Suddenly, a figure burst out of the shadows. It was Tasha, her clothes dirty, her hair disheveled, and her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. Tasha! Isaiah cried, running toward her. Are you okay? Are you hurt? Tasha shook her head, her brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. She pulled the crumpled letter from her pocket and thrust it into Isaiah's hands. They're going to kill Mr. Simon tonight, Isaiah. We have to stop them. Isaiah stared at the letter, his pale blue eyes wide with fear and determination. He looked up at Tasha, their breath misting in the cold air. We have to tell Inspector Morgan. Now! Mr. Simon can't die tonight. Tasha nodded, her voice trembling but firm. We'll stop her, Isaiah. No matter what happens, we'll save him. The two children turned back toward the police station, their hands clasped tightly together. Above them, the city's lights twinkled like distant stars in the frigid night sky. The final battle was approaching, and Isaiah and Tasha knew they couldn't falter. Not now. The night sky hung heavy, thick clouds smothering the pale light of the moon. The yellow glow of streetlights reflected on rain-soaked cobblestones, casting flickering shadows along empty streets. Silence stretched over the city like a suffocating blanket, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to unfold. Isaiah and Tasha stood beneath a flickering street lamp outside the police station. Their breaths came in sharp, visible puffs in the freezing air. Isaiah clutched the USB drive and Amelia's incriminating letter tightly in his pocket. What do we do now, Tasha? Mr. Simon is in danger. We can't just stand here. Isaiah's voice trembled with fear. Tasha squeezed his hand tightly, her sharp brown eyes reflecting steely determination. We need to find Inspector Morgan immediately. He's our only hope now. They dashed inside the police station. The front desk was nearly deserted, with only a few officers engaged in hushed conversations. Inspector Morgan appeared from a hallway, his face etched with worry, his eyes sharp with urgency. There you are. I've been looking for you two. We have bad news. The team monitoring Simon's house has gone completely silent. Isaiah's hand tightened around the USB drive, his voice barely a whisper. Inspector Morgan, we have to go there now. They're planning to kill him tonight. Morgan's jaw clenched as he nodded resolutely. Get in the car. Now. We don't have a second to waste. The police cruiser sped through empty streets, its siren piercing the silent night. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the drizzle, reflecting off wet asphalt. Tasha sat in the back seat next to Isaiah, her small hands gripping his tightly. Neither spoke, but their eyes were filled with shared fear. Morgan's knuckles turned white around the steering wheel as he spoke, his voice low and firm. Listen, kids, when we arrive, you must stay in the car. This is police work, and I can't risk you getting hurt. Tasha met Morgan's eyes in the rearview mirror, her defiance clear. We can't just sit and do nothing while Mr. Simon's life is in danger. Morgan sighed heavily, but didn't argue further. The sirens blared into the night as the car hurtled toward the looming shadow of Simon's mansion. The police car screeched to a stop outside the grand estate. The mansion loomed in the darkness, its silhouette imposing against the cloudy sky. Most of the lights inside were out, except for a faint glow from one upper window. The iron gates were ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Morgan signaled for the children to stay put before stepping out with a team of officers. But Isaiah and Tasha exchanged a glance. Neither of them had any intention of waiting in safety. They slipped out of the car, blending into the shadows as they crept through the overgrown garden, following the officers from a distance. Inside the mansion, an eerie silence hung in the air. The sound of footsteps echoed on polished wooden floors as Morgan and his team advanced cautiously. A faint trail of blood smeared across the staircase, leading upward. Something's wrong here, Morgan muttered under his breath, his gun drawn. Isaiah and Tasha snuck through the dim hallways, carefully avoiding detection. Suddenly, a faint, desperate voice broke the silence. Help, help me. It was Simon's voice. Morgan and his team raced up the staircase toward the sound. Isaiah and Tasha followed closely behind, their hearts pounding like war drums in their chests. At the end of a dimly lit hallway stood Simon's bedroom. The door was a soft glow spilling out into the corridor. Inside, Simon lay motionless on the bed, his face pale, his eyes barely open. Standing beside him was Amelia, holding a syringe filled with a glowing blue liquid. Stop right there, Amelia, Morgan shouted, his gun trained on her. Amelia turned slowly, her face twisted into a sickly smile. You're too late, Inspector. The curtain is closing on poor Simon. Isaiah couldn't hold back any longer. He broke from his hiding spot and yelled, No, don't hurt him! Amelia flinched, her grip on the syringe loosening for just a moment. Tasha seized the opportunity and lunged forward, knocking the syringe from Amelia's hand. It shattered on the marble floor, the liquid spreading like a sinister stain. Morgan and the officers swarmed Amelia, restraining her as she shrieked and struggled. You fools! You think you've won? You'll never stop me! Amelia was handcuffed and dragged out of the room, her manic screams fading as she was escorted away. Morgan approached Simon, feeling for a pulse at his neck. He's alive, but barely. Call an ambulance now. Isaiah and Tasha rushed to Simon's bedside. His eyelids fluttered open, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Isaiah, Tasha, you did it. Tears welled in Isaiah's eyes as he gripped Simon's frail hand. You're going to be okay, Mr. Simon. You have to be. We still need you. The mansion's driveway was a chaotic scene as paramedics loaded Simon into an ambulance. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pale gold and soft blue. Amelia, her once pristine fur coat stained with dust and sweat, was led into a police car. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes burned with cold hatred. Morgan stood beside Isaiah and Tasha, his face lined with exhaustion but softened by a rare smile. You two, you've done something extraordinary tonight. You've not only saved a man's life, but brought a dangerous criminal to justice. I'm proud of you both. Tasha smiled weakly, tears trailing down her dirt-streaked cheeks. We couldn't let her win, Inspector. Mr. Simon deserved better. Isaiah gazed at the rising sun, his heart finally easing from the weight of fear and uncertainty. It's over. It's finally over. As the golden light of dawn washed over the mansion, the sound of police sirens faded into the distance. The shadows of the night retreated, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Isaiah and Tasha allowed themselves to breathe. Together, they stood side by side, looking toward the rising sun. The road ahead would still be difficult, but for now, hope had found a way to shine through the darkness. The early morning sky shifted from a dull gray to a soft shade of amber, but the warmth of dawn couldn't dispel the heavy atmosphere hanging over Simon Grant's mansion. Yellow and black police tape stretched across the entrance, patrol cars clustered outside, and blue and red emergency lights flickered in the pale light of dawn. Isaiah and Tasha stood beside Inspector Morgan, who was coordinating officers moving briskly around the estate. Although Amelia had been arrested, danger still lingered. Simon was clinging to life in a hospital bed, his condition teetering on the edge between life and death. Morgan adjusted his long trench coat, his tired eyes filled with determination. We're not done yet. Amelia might be in custody, but she wasn't working alone. Dr. Mallory is still out there, and he's likely covering his tracks as we speak. Isaiah clenched his small fists, his worn scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. Then we have to stop him, Inspector Morgan. We can't let him get away with this. Tasha's voice cut through, sharp and steady. Mallory is the last piece of the puzzle. Once we catch him, it'll all be over. Morgan nodded, his eyes narrowing with focus. We've tracked financial transactions from Amelia's accounts. Thanks to the USB drive you two recovered, a significant sum was recently transferred to an anonymous account linked to a private clinic on the outskirts of the city. Mallory's running out of time, and so are we. Hours later, in a makeshift operations room at the police station, Morgan, Isaiah, and Tasha huddled around a computer screen. A young officer named James displayed a series of suspicious bank transactions. Based on the records from the USB, we've traced a large transfer from Amelia's account to a private medical clinic on the city outskirts, James explained, highlighting the final transaction on the screen. Morgan's jaw tightened as he studied the details. A private clinic? He's hiding there. He knows we're closing in, and he's preparing to run. Tasha slammed her small fist on the table, her brown eyes blazing with determination. We have to catch him now! He can't escape justice! Morgan stood, slipping on his trench coat and grabbing his radio. Let's go. This ends tonight. The private clinic stood isolated on the outskirts of the city, a 3-story building with peeling white paint and dim lights glowing faintly from the second-floor windows. The surrounding area was eerily silent, the only sound the distant rustling of dead leaves in the cold breeze. Morgan signaled his officers to fan out and surround the building. Isaiah and Tasha stood at his side, their eyes fixed on the faint silhouette of a figure passing by one of the upstairs windows. "He's up there," Isaiah whispered. "Stay here, both of you," Morgan ordered firmly. "This is police business." But Isaiah and Tasha shared a look. Their determination was clear. They weren't going to stand aside. Morgan led a team of officers through the clinic's front doors, their weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the darkness. The sharp smell of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of something metallic. Blood, perhaps. Framed medical certificates and faded paintings lined the sterile hallway, and doors to examination rooms stood ajar. "Mallory, this is the police. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Morgan's voice echoed through the hallway. A gunshot rang out from upstairs. Everyone froze, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Isaiah and Tasha, who had been quietly trailing behind the officers, exchanged a glance and continued moving, keeping their steps as quiet as possible. On the top floor, a heavy wooden door marked Dr. Mallory Office stood slightly ajar, faint light seeping through the gap. Morgan signaled for his team to prepare for entry. With a sharp nod, he began the countdown. 3, 2, 1. The door burst open with a crash. Inside, Dr. Mallory stood hunched over a desk, stuffing papers and vials into a small leather bag. His thin face was pale, and his glasses reflected the flashlight beams. "Freeze, Mallory!" Morgan commanded, his gun aimed steadily at the doctor. "It's over." Mallory slowly raised his trembling hands, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. You have no proof. I'm just a doctor." Mallory stammered. Isaiah stepped forward, his small voice cutting through the silence. "You're lying. We have proof. Everything you said to Amelia, every plan you made. You agreed to poison Mr. Simon." Mallory's face twisted with fear and anger as his desperate facade crumbled. I had no choice. Amelia forced me. She said if I didn't do it, she'd ruin me." Morgan approached cautiously, handcuffs ready. "Following orders doesn't absolve you of responsibility, Mallory. People like Simon Grant suffer because of men like you." The officers moved in and secured Mallory, his wrists clamped in cold steel handcuffs. Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder as more police vehicles arrived. The red and blue lights painted Mallory's pale face in harsh, unforgiving colors. Back outside, Isaiah and Tasha stood under the faint light of dawn. The ordeal was finally over. The sky, once heavy with darkness, was now painted with streaks of pink and gold. Morgan approached them, his face lined with exhaustion, but softened by a rare smile. "You two, you've done something extraordinary. Not only did you save Simon's life, but you also brought two dangerous criminals to justice. You're braver than most adults I know." Tasha wiped a tear from her dirt-streaked face, her voice trembling slightly. "We couldn't let them win, Inspector Morgan. Mr. Simon deserved better." Isaiah gazed at the soft light of dawn breaking over the horizon, his breath fogging up in the chilly air. "I hope Mr. Simon wakes up. He deserves a second chance." Morgan placed a reassuring hand on both their shoulders. "He's a fighter, Isaiah, just like the two of you." As the police cars began to pull away, carrying Mallory into custody, the last remnants of the night faded. The first rays of the sun illuminated the faces of Isaiah and Tasha, two small figures who had defied the odds and faced unimaginable danger. "We gave it everything we had, Isaiah. No matter what happens next, we did the right thing." Tasha's voice was steady. Isaiah nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet strength. "Yes, Tasha, we did." Across the street, the clinic stood empty, its shadows banished by the rising sun. And as the golden light spread across the city, Isaiah and Tasha stood together, knowing that their courage had made all the difference. The battle was over, but their story, one of resilience, loyalty, and hope, would live on. The first light of dawn broke through the narrow gaps between towering skyscrapers, casting a golden glow on the rain-soaked streets below. Simon Grant's mansion stood silent, surrounded by yellow and black police tape. The air was still, almost holding its breath, broken only by the distant chirping of birds and the faint whistle of the winter wind through barren branches. Isaiah and Tasha sat on the steps of the police station, their faces pale, eyes sunken with exhaustion, and clothes stained with mud and rain. Each passing minute felt stretched and endless. Clutched tightly in Isaiah's trembling hands was the USB drive. His fingers curled around it as if letting go would cause everything to vanish. Inspector Morgan stepped out of the station, his face etched with lines of fatigue, yet his eyes carried a glimmer of resolve. Isaiah, Tasha, come inside. There are some people who want to meet you. The two children exchanged a glance before slowly rising and following Morgan into the dimly lit meeting room. Around a long conference table sat stern-faced senior officers, their gazes fixed on the large screen at the end of the room. The USB was plugged into a computer. The screen flickered to life, displaying files filled with medical records, financial transactions, and chilling audio recordings. Amelia's voice crackled through the speakers. Mallory, you're certain this dosage will gradually weaken Simon, aren't you? I don't want any mistakes. Dr. Mallory's trembling voice followed. Yes, Mrs. Amelia. The dosage won't kill him immediately, but it will slowly deteriorate his health. No one will suspect a thing. A heavy silence fell over the room. A senior officer at the head of the table leaned forward, his voice grave. This evidence is undeniable. Amelia, Grant, and Dr. Mallory conspired to poison Simon. They'll answer for their crimes. Morgan turned to face Isaiah and Tasha, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. You two, you've done something that even our entire system sometimes struggles to accomplish. You've brought justice to Simon Grant. Isaiah lowered his head, his small shoulders trembling slightly. Tasha placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. We just did what was right, Inspector Morgan. Outside the police station, a crowd of reporters and flashing cameras had gathered. The bright lights reflected off the cold pavement, and the hum of urgent voices filled the air. As the doors opened, Inspector Morgan stepped out, flanked by Isaiah and Tasha. Morgan raised a hand, calling for silence, and began speaking into the sea of microphones. With the evidence we've gathered, Amelia Grant and Dr. Stashladingo Mallory have been charged with conspiracy to poison Simon Grant in a calculated and ruthless plan. The evidence is overwhelming, and justice will be served. A young reporter raised his hand, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Inspector, what role did these two children play in solving this case? Morgan rested a hand on Isaiah and Tasha's shoulders, his voice filled with admiration. Isaiah and Tasha are the true heroes of this story. Their courage, determination, and refusal to give up brought us the evidence we needed to stop this crime. Without them, Simon Grant wouldn't have had a chance. Isaiah kept his head down, clutching his worn scarf tightly in his hands, while Tasha bit her lip, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. Later that day, Isaiah and Tasha were escorted to the hospital where Simon was being treated. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as they walked through the quiet corridors, their footsteps echoing faintly. In a dimly lit room, Simon lay on a hospital bed, an IV drip attached to his frail arm. His face was pale, but his eyes fluttered open as the two children approached. Isaiah, Tasha, you're here. Simon's voice was faint, but his lips curled into a weak smile. Isaiah stepped closer, his blue eyes brimming with tears. Mr. Simon, we did it. Amelia and Dr. Mallory, they've been arrested. They can't hurt you anymore. Simon's trembling hand reached out, and Isaiah took it gently. Thank you, both of you. I thought it was over, but you never gave up on me. Tasha squeezed Simon's other hand, her voice steady despite the tears pooling in her eyes. You're going to get better, Mr. Simon. We still have so much to do together. Simon nodded weakly, tears slipping down his cheeks as his eyes closed, this time in peaceful rest. The next day, the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the city in a warm, golden glow. The rain-soaked streets dried under its gentle light, and a faint sense of calm replaced the turmoil of the past days. Isaiah and Tasha sat on a park bench near the hospital, watching children play on the grass. The air smelled fresh, and for the first time in a long while, the world felt quiet and still. Isaiah turned to Tasha, his voice soft but steady. We did it, Tasha. Mr. Simon is safe, and they'll pay for what they did. Tasha smiled faintly, but her eyes carried a distant look. Yes, but this isn't the end, Isaiah. It's just a new beginning. Above them, a flock of birds soared across the clear blue sky, their wings catching the sunlight as they flew freely toward the horizon. Isaiah leaned back, his small hands tucked into his worn scarf. We're going to be okay, Tasha. We did the right thing. Tasha nodded, her smile growing warmer. Yes, Isaiah, and we'll keep moving forward, no matter what. The sun climbed higher into the sky, its light painting the city in hues of gold and warmth. For Isaiah and Tasha, the journey had been long and perilous, but justice had been served and hope had been restored. As they sat there in the park, side by side, they knew this was not the end, just a pause before the next chapter of their lives began. And whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The sun shone brightly above, casting its light on two brave children who had dared to face the darkest shadows and emerged victorious. The first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the city courthouse, casting a golden glow on the aged stone walls and the towering antique clock above the judge's bench. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs from reporters, journalists, and a few close acquaintances of Simon Grant. Isaiah and Tasha sat in the witness section, both dressed in clean, modest outfits provided by Inspector Morgan. Isaiah clutched his worn, knitted scarf tightly around his neck, his pale blue eyes filled with nervous anticipation. Beside him, Tasha sat upright, her sharp brown eyes fixed on the large wooden doors at the front of the courtroom. The heavy doors creaked open. Amelia entered, her wrists shackled in cold steel cuffs, yet her posture radiated arrogance. She wore a sharp gray suit, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, and her sharp eyes scanned the room with a predatory gleam. Behind her shuffled Dr. Bay, Mallory, his sunken eyes darting nervously around the room as he clutched his trembling hands together. Simon Grant was wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair, guided by a nurse. His face was pale and hollow, but his eyes burned with a quiet determination. The judge entered, his gavel striking the sound block with a resounding crack. Court is now in session. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man in a crisp black suit, rose from his seat and stepped toward the jury box. His voice echoed through the tense room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not merely a case of attempted murder. It is a tale of greed, manipulation, and calculated cruelty. Amelia Grant, the wife of Simon Grant, along with Dr. Mallory, conspired to poison Mr. Grant in an attempt to claim his vast fortune. The courtroom fell silent. Amelia smirked faintly, but her expression froze as an audio recording from the USB crackled through the speakers. You're certain this dosage will weaken Simon gradually, aren't you? I can't afford any mistakes. Dr. Mallory lowered his head, his hands shaking violently. We have also uncovered financial transactions between Amelia and Dr. Mallory, providing undeniable proof of their motives and actions, the prosecutor continued. In the back row, Inspector Morgan sat quietly, his steely gaze fixed on the defendants. He exchanged a brief, reassuring nod with Tasha when her eyes met his. The judge called Isaiah to the witness stand. The boy hesitated for a moment before rising, clutching his scarf tightly in his trembling hands. Tasha gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze and whispered, You can do this, Isaiah. I believe in you. Isaiah walked to the stand, his small figure seeming even smaller in the grand courtroom. His pale blue eyes met the judge's before shifting to Amelia. My name is Isaiah. I met Mr. Simon on a cold winter night. He gave me food and treated me with kindness like I mattered. He told me he was afraid. He believed Mrs. Amelia was poisoning him. His voice wavered slightly, but grew stronger as he continued. Tasha and I searched for answers. We found her notes and heard the recordings between her and Dr. Mallory. They weren't just trying to make him sick. They wanted him dead. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Amelia sat frozen, her face locked in an icy glare. The defense attorney started to rise, but the judge raised a hand, signaling him to remain seated. Thank you, Isaiah. You've shown incredible courage today, the judge said. Tasha was called next. She walked confidently to the stand, her brown eyes fierce with determination. Mrs. Amelia never loved Mr. Simon. To her, he was just a stepping stone to wealth and power. Isaiah and I risked everything to bring the truth to light. I just hope justice will be served today. Amelia suddenly rose from her seat, her voice sharp and shrill. This is all a misunderstanding. I loved my husband. These so-called evidences could have been fabricated. I had no reason to hurt him. Dr. Mallory's voice trembled as he interrupted, panic written across his face. I only followed orders. She forced me. I didn't want this. Amelia spun to face him, her eyes blazing with fury. You spineless coward. You're just as guilty as I am. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming across the room. Order in the court. Both defendants will remain silent. The room quieted once more, the weight of the moment settling heavily in the air. From his wheelchair, Simon watched Amelia with tired but clear eyes, a single tear rolling down his pale cheek. The judge turned to the jury and spoke gravely. After reviewing the evidence, listening to witness testimonies, and considering the findings of law enforcement, this court finds Amelia Grant and Dr. Mallory guilty of first-degree attempted murder. Both will face the full weight of the law for their actions. The courtroom erupted into hushed whispers as Amelia screamed in protest, thrashing against the officers who came to escort her away. Dr. Mallory slumped forward, his face buried in his hands as he was led out, defeated and broken. Simon closed his eyes and let out a slow breath, his shoulders sinking into his wheelchair. Isaiah and Tasha hugged each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces, not from sadness but from relief. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, casting warm rays across the stone steps. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, and questions were shouted, but Isaiah, Tasha, and Simon were shielded by Inspector Morgan as they made their way down the steps. Simon, seated in his wheelchair, looked at the two children beside him, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, both of you. Without your bravery, I wouldn't be here today." Tasha gripped Simon's hand tightly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You gave us hope when we thought we had none, Mr. Simon. You showed us kindness when no one else did. This was the least we could do." Isaiah looked up at the sky, the sun's light reflecting in his pale blue eyes. "It's over now. Justice was served and the truth was revealed." Inspector Morgan placed a hand on each child's shoulder, his voice low but firm. "You two aren't just survivors. You're heroes. And don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." As the police vehicles carrying Amelia and Mallory disappeared down the street, the city seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The shadows that had loomed so large were finally receding, replaced by light, clarity, and hope. In the warm embrace of the sunlight, Isaiah, Tasha, and Simon sat together, sharing a quiet moment of peace. The battle was over and justice had prevailed. But for Isaiah and Tasha, this was not an ending. It was a new beginning, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with courage in their hearts and hope lighting their path forward. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the city after days of darkness and tension. A soft breeze carried the scent of flowers from nearby parks, mingling with the cheerful chirping of birds perched on tree branches. The air felt lighter, fresher, almost as if the entire city had exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Inside a quiet hospital room, Simon Grant lay on a pristine white bed near the window. Gentle sunlight illuminated his gaunt but peaceful face. A blanket was pulled up to his chest, and his frail hand rested lightly on the bed's railing. Though he still appeared weak, his breathing was steady and his color had returned slightly. Isaiah and Tasha sat on either side of his bed, each holding one of Simon's hands. Both children looked cleaner in the hospital clothes provided by the nurses, but the exhaustion and tension of sleepless nights still lingered in their eyes. Simon's eyelids fluttered open and a faint, warm smile spread across his face as he recognized them. "Isaiah, Tasha, you're still here." Isaiah tightened his grip on Simon's hand, his pale blue eyes glistening with emotion. "I promised you, Mr. Simon, I wasn't going to leave you." Tasha smirked softly, her voice laced with a playful tone despite her exhaustion. "And don't think you can get rid of us that easily, old man." Simon let out a weak chuckle, but it quickly turned into a cough. Tasha grabbed the glass of water from the table and handed it to him. Simon took a small sip, then looked at them with deep gratitude in his eyes. "I owe you two my life. Without you, I wouldn't be here to see another sunrise." The door creaked open, and Inspector Morgan entered the room. He wore a neatly pressed suit, his face etched with fatigue, but still carrying his usual air of authority and calm. He carried a fruit basket and placed it on the table beside Simon's bed. "Simon, you're looking better already." Simon nodded faintly, his smile kind. "Thank you, Morgan, for everything." Morgan sat in a nearby chair, glancing at Isaiah and Tasha with a look of quiet admiration. "And you two, Isaiah, Tasha, you've done something extraordinary. You've shown courage and resilience that even most adults would struggle to muster. You've proven that heroism doesn't come with age." Isaiah looked down, his small shoulders trembling slightly. Tasha met Morgan's gaze with pride and determination sparkling in her brown eyes. Morgan continued, his voice firm but gentle. Amelia and Dr. Mallory will face the full weight of the law. The evidence is undeniable. Justice has been served, and Simon is safe because of you two. Simon exhaled deeply, his eyes reflecting a sense of peace. I was so afraid it would all end in darkness, but because of you, the light found its way back. Morgan's phone buzzed, and he excused himself to step outside, leaving Simon, Isaiah, and Tasha in the soft, golden glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the window. Simon looked at the two children, his gaze tender and filled with affection. Isaiah, Tasha, you've been through so much, more than any child should ever have to endure. But even when things seemed impossible, you didn't give up. That's something truly special. Isaiah bit his lip, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want you to die. You were the first person who ever treated me like I mattered. Tasha turned her head away, her shoulders trembling slightly. Simon reached out and rested his hand gently on her shoulder. You two are the bravest children I've ever met. I want you to know that from this moment on, you won't have to worry about tomorrow. You're not alone anymore. Tasha turned back, her eyes red and glistening with tears. I just wanted it all to stop. I didn't want anyone else to suffer anymore. Simon nodded, his own eyes glistening with tears. In that quiet moment, an invisible yet unbreakable bond formed between the three of them, a bond forged through fear, courage, and ultimately, love. A nurse entered the room holding a clipboard and wearing a warm smile. Mr. Grant, your latest test results look very promising. If everything continues to improve, you'll be able to leave the hospital in about a week. The room seemed to brighten with the news. Isaiah and Tasha cheered softly, their faces lighting up with joy. Simon smiled, his face finally free from worry. That's wonderful news. Thank you, nurse. Isaiah squeezed Simon's hand, his voice trembling with relief. You're going to be okay, Mr. Simon. Everything's going to be okay now. Simon gently squeezed Isaiah's hand back. Yes, Isaiah, everything will be okay. Later that afternoon, Isaiah, Tasha, and Inspector Morgan took a walk in the park near the hospital. Leaves scattered in shades of gold and brown crunched beneath their feet as a soft breeze played with their hair. Tasha sat down on an old wooden bench, tilting her face upward to the clear blue sky. It's finally over. It feels unreal. Isaiah sat beside her, his voice filled with both relief and uncertainty. But, do you think we can start over? Like, really start over? Away from the streets, away from everything? Morgan stood in front of them, his gaze steady but kind. You deserve a fresh start, both of you. Simon has already asked me to make sure you're taken care of. You won't have to worry about surviving on your own anymore. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and fresh leaves as Isaiah and Tasha exchanged a look, one filled with hope, something they hadn't dared to feel in a long time. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park, Isaiah and Tasha found themselves standing on a small bridge overlooking a rippling river below. Tasha, where do you think we'll go from here? Isaiah asked softly. Tasha leaned on the railing, her brown eyes focused on the water below. I don't know, Isaiah, but I believe things will be better. We won't have to run anymore. The two of them clasped hands, staring out into the horizon where the sun was slowly setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The past had been harsh, and the road ahead was uncertain. But as the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, like stars scattered across the ground, one thing was clear. They had survived. They had brought justice. And most importantly, they had hope. The soft morning sun cast a golden glow over the large hospital windows, bathing the room in gentle warmth. From above, the city looked calm, its usual bustle subdued, as though the shadows of the past days had never touched it. The final leaves of autumn clung to the branches, trembling slightly in the crisp breeze before letting go and drifting softly to the ground below. In the hospital's small garden, Isaiah and Tasha sat on a stone bench near a bubbling fountain. The soothing sound of trickling water blended with the distant chirps of birds. Isaiah fiddled with his worn scarf, his pale blue eyes following a small bird hopping along the brick pathway. Do you think Mr. Simon is feeling better? Isaiah asked softly. Tasha, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, nodded gently. He's stronger than we think, Isaiah. I'm sure he'll be okay. Slow footsteps echoed behind them. Simon appeared, seated in a wheelchair pushed by a young nurse. He looked far better than he had in days. His eyes sparkled with life, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Good morning, my little heroes," Simon greeted warmly. Isaiah and Tasha sprang up from the bench and rushed toward him. Tasha rested her hands on the armrest of his wheelchair, her brown eyes glimmering with joy. "Mr. Simon, you look so much better." Simon reached out, taking both their hands in his own. "Thanks to you two, I'm here today, breathing in this fresh air. I owe you both more than I can ever repay." The nurse stepped back to give them privacy, and Simon gestured for the children to sit close. Sunlight highlighted every line etched into his face, but his expression was gentle and full of love. "Isaiah, Tasha, I've spent a lot of time thinking these past few days. I can't just sit by and let you two continue wandering the streets, facing hunger, fear, and danger." Isaiah looked down, clutching his scarf tightly in his hands. I don't want to be a burden, Mr. Simon." Simon shook his head firmly, his gaze serious but kind. "Isaiah, Tasha, you are not a burden. You've done something that very few people, adults or children, would ever dare to do. You fought for the truth, for justice, and for a stranger's life." Tasha met Simon's eyes, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you saying, Mr. Simon?" Simon took a deep breath, then spoke slowly and clearly. "I want you both to come live with me. I want to be your guardian, to give you a home, a family, and most importantly, a future." Isaiah's eyes went wide with shock, his face frozen between disbelief and fear. Tasha squeezed Isaiah's hand tightly, her brown eyes shimmering with hope. You really mean that, Mr. Simon?" Isaiah stammered. Simon nodded resolutely. "I've never been more certain about anything. Isaiah, you have a kind heart and a courage that shines through every challenge. And Tasha, you are sharp, brave, and strong beyond your years. You both deserve love, protection, and a chance to grow without fear." Tasha smiled, her lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes, but Isaiah remained silent. His head dropped slightly, his small hands gripping the edge of his coat. "I don't know. I've spent my whole life running, living on the streets, a real home. I don't know what to do with it." Simon extended a hand and placed it gently on Isaiah's shoulder. "Isaiah, a home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's a place where you feel safe, where you're loved, and where you belong. You two have been out in the cold for too long. It's time for you to come home." A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Tasha's voice broke the stillness, soft but filled with conviction. "Isaiah, we deserve this. We've fought so hard, and Mr. Simon, he's a good man." Isaiah looked at her, then back at Simon. There was hesitation in his gaze, but there was also something else, a glimmer of hope. "Mr. Simon, if I say yes, are you sure you won't regret it?" Simon chuckled softly, his warm smile breaking through his weathered features. "I've lost too much to regret anything anymore, Isaiah." Finally, Isaiah nodded, tears spilling silently down his cheeks. Tasha let out a soft sob and threw her arms around Simon's armrest, clutching him tightly. "Then we say yes, Mr. Simon." Isaiah's voice wavered, but it was firm. Simon's smile widened, his own eyes glistening with tears. "Welcome home, Isaiah. Welcome home, Tasha." A few weeks later, Isaiah and Tasha stood in front of Simon's grand estate, the very place they had once snuck into under the cover of darkness, driven by fear and desperation. But this time, they weren't trespassers. There was no fear in their steps, only nervous excitement. Simon waited for them at the front entrance, sitting in his wheelchair with the nurse by his side. The sun bathed the house in golden light, and the garden was alive with color and movement. The children stepped through the grand gates, hand in hand. Simon opened his arms wide. "Welcome home, my children." Tasha broke into tears, running forward to hug Simon tightly. Isaiah hesitated for just a moment before following, clutching Simon's arm as if afraid he might disappear. The mansion doors closed softly behind them, but inside there was no more darkness, no more cold shadows, only warmth, light, and the promise of a new beginning. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the sky, Isaiah and Tasha sat together on the steps of the estate, watching the sky change colors. "We really found a home, didn't we, Tasha?" Isaiah said softly. Tasha smiled, her face peaceful and calm. "Yes, Isaiah, we finally did." Above them, the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, and the city lights shimmered in the distance. The road that had brought them here had been long and treacherous, but they had made it, together. And this time, they weren't alone. They were home. The soft morning sunlight filtered through sheer white curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Isaiah's room no longer resembled a cold corner of an alleyway or the damp space beneath a bridge. Instead, it was filled with comfort: a cozy bed with a plush blanket, a small wooden bookshelf by the window, and framed paintings of serene landscapes adorning the walls. Isaiah sat by the window, his pale blue eyes gazing down at the sprawling garden below. Birds chirped from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, Tasha's laughter echoed as she played with the small puppy Simon had recently adopted. Clutched tightly in Isaiah's hands was his old scarf, the last remnant of his life on the streets. Despite the warmth and safety surrounding him now, there was still a lingering uncertainty in his heart, an unsettled feeling that whispered he didn't quite belong here. The door creaked open, and Simon wheeled himself into the room. He wore a thick knitted sweater, and though his face was lined with age and recent struggles, his smile was gentle and his eyes were bright. "Good morning, Isaiah. What are you thinking about?" Isaiah turned away from the window, offering a weak smile. "I'm just thinking about everything, Mr. Simon." Simon wheeled closer to the window, the sunlight illuminating the silver strands in his hair and the soft lines on his face. He looked at Isaiah for a long moment before speaking. "I can see something is troubling you, Isaiah. You don't have to hide it from me." Isaiah lowered his gaze, his small hands gripping the scarf even tighter. "I'm not sure, Mr. Simon. I don't know if I really deserve this place. This beautiful house, this safety. I'm just a street kid." Simon let out a soft sigh, his eyes filled with understanding. "Isaiah, listen to me. A home isn't defined by the walls or the expensive things inside it. A home is built on love, trust, and the people who care about each other. You're not an intruder here, and you're not a burden. You're a part of this family now." Isaiah shook his head slowly, his voice trembling. "But my past, the things I've done just to survive. Are you sure you don't regret bringing me here?" Simon placed his trembling hand on Isaiah's shoulder, his grip gentle but firm. "I have never once regretted taking you in, Isaiah. If there's one thing I do regret, it's not finding you sooner, so I could have pulled you out of those cold and lonely nights earlier." Silence filled the room. Outside, Tasha's laughter mingled with the playful barks of the puppy. Sunlight bathed Isaiah's face, highlighting the uncertainty and emotion in his pale blue eyes. That afternoon, Isaiah and Tasha sat on a wooden swing beneath a sprawling oak tree in the garden. Shafts of golden light streamed through the branches, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the ground. Tasha rocked gently on her swing, her brown hair catching the sunlight as it danced in the breeze. Isaiah sat still beside her, his gaze fixed downward on his worn shoes. "Isaiah, why are you so quiet? Is something bothering you?" Isaiah lifted his head slightly, his voice soft and unsure. "Tasha, do you ever feel like you don't belong somewhere?" Tasha frowned thoughtfully, then offered a small smile. "At first, yes. When Mr. Simon said we could stay here, I was scared. I was afraid I'd mess something up, that he'd change his mind and send me away. But then I realized if I didn't give myself a chance, I'd never know if this place could truly feel like home." Isaiah stayed silent, his fingers curling around the edge of his scarf. Tasha continued, "Isaiah, Mr. Simon cares about us. He gave us a chance because he sees something in us, something good. We deserve this, Isaiah. You deserve this." Isaiah's gaze lifted, and for a moment, hope flickered in his eyes. "Do you really think so?" Tasha nodded firmly, her voice steady. "I believe it with all my heart, and you should too." That evening, dinner was served in the grand dining room. The golden light from the chandelier bathed the table in warmth, and the aroma of delicious food filled the air. Simon sat at the head of the table, with Isaiah and Tasha on either side. Simon raised his glass of orange juice, his voice carrying warmth and sincerity. "We've all been through a long and difficult journey, but tonight we're here together, and that's the most precious thing of all. I want you both to know that no matter what happens, this will always be your home." Isaiah took a deep breath and looked up at Simon. His voice was soft, but there was resolve in his words. "Mr. Simon, I want to stay. I want to believe that I deserve this." Simon's smile was radiant, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. Tasha clapped her hands together, her face breaking into a wide grin. "Welcome home, Isaiah. Simon said warmly. Later that night, the house was quiet under the silvery light of the moon. Isaiah lay in his soft bed, the gentle weight of the blanket comforting him. Moonlight streamed in through the window, painting pale streaks across the floor. In his hands, Isaiah held his old scarf. But tonight, it felt different. It wasn't just a reminder of the cold and lonely nights anymore. It was a symbol of his strength, of the journey he had taken, and of the warmth he had finally found. Isaiah closed his eyes, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. For the first time, he let himself believe that he belonged, that he was home. Morning sunlight poured through the grand windows of the estate, bathing the white curtains and polished wooden floors in a golden glow. The air was warm, calm, and still, an atmosphere of serenity that seemed to envelop every corner of the house. Tasha sat on the wide windowsill in her room, her legs dangling over the edge as a soft breeze tousled her brown hair. From up here, she could see the sprawling garden below. Isaiah was running across the grass, laughing as Max, their playful puppy, chased after him. The cheerful barks of Max and Isaiah's laughter echoed in the distance, but Tasha's face remained thoughtful, her brows slightly furrowed. In her hand was a crumpled piece of paper, a fragile fragment of her past, a reminder of the lonely days spent without shelter or family. Tasha! Come down here and play with me, Isaiah's voice called up from the garden below. Tasha managed a faint smile, but her brown eyes reflected a deep uncertainty. Breakfast in Simon's warm and inviting kitchen was peaceful. The soft crackle of the fireplace and the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. Simon sat in his wheelchair at the head of the table, while Isaiah and Tasha sat across from each other. Tasha, you seem a little different today. Is everything all right? Simon asked gently, his kind eyes fixed on her face. Tasha looked up, her brown eyes glistening as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She set her fork down, her small hands twisting nervously in her lap. Mr. Simon, if I wanted to leave, would you be upset? The room fell silent. Isaiah froze mid-bite, his pale blue eyes widening as he stared at her. Simon leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but serious. Tasha, why would you want to leave? Are you unhappy here? Tasha shook her head quickly. No, Mr. Simon, this is the safest, warmest place I've ever known. But I'm not sure I belong here. I feel like there's something out there waiting for me. Isaiah put down his fork, his voice trembling. Where would you go, Tasha? After everything we've been through, you can't leave me behind. Tasha turned to look at Isaiah, tears pooling in her eyes. Isaiah, I can't explain it properly, but there's something inside me, something telling me I need to search for answers. Maybe it's my family, or maybe it's just something I need to know about myself. That afternoon, Tasha sat beside a small pond in the garden, her reflection rippling on the water's surface as golden leaves drifted down from the trees above. Simon wheeled himself silently closer, stopping a few feet away. Tasha, would you like to talk to me? She turned, her brown eyes glimmering with unshed tears. Mr. Simon, when I was little, I remember a woman's voice calling my name. But after that, everything became blurry. I only remember her worried eyes looking at me. Simon listened quietly, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze soft and understanding. Tasha, sometimes what we're searching for isn't a physical place. It's a missing piece of ourselves, something we need to find to feel whole again. Tasha looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to leave you and Isaiah, but I'm afraid if I don't go, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Simon nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. I understand, Tasha. Some journeys must be taken alone. But remember this house, this place, will always be your home. No matter how far you go, you will always have a place to return to. That night, Isaiah sat on the staircase in the dimly lit hallway. The flickering light from a nearby lamp cast long shadows on the wooden floor. Tasha approached slowly, her small shoes making faint creaks with each step. Isaiah, I'm sorry. Isaiah looked up, his pale blue eyes filled with hurt and sadness. Tasha, why do you have to go? We have everything here. Mr. Simon cares about us. This is our home. Tasha sat down beside him, her shoulders trembling slightly. Isaiah, I don't want to leave you. You're my best friend, the only family I've ever had, but something is calling me, something I can't ignore. I have to go, Isaiah. I have to find out what it is. Isaiah was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice soft and hesitant. I. I understand, but you have to promise me one thing. What is it? Be careful. And if you find what you're looking for, please come back. I'll be waiting for you, Tasha. Tears rolled down Tasha's cheeks as she threw her arms around Isaiah. I promise. I'll come back, Isaiah. I promise. The next morning, Tasha stood at the grand gates of the estate. A small backpack was slung over her shoulders and a thick coat wrapped tightly around her. Isaiah and Simon stood beside her, the golden light of dawn casting long shadows on the gravel path. Simon reached out and took Tasha's small hand in his. Remember what I said, Tasha. This door will always be open for you. This will always be your home. Tasha nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I'll miss you so much, Mr. Simon. Isaiah stepped forward, eyes throwing his arms around Tasha in one final embrace. Tasha, don't forget your promise. Please come back. Tasha pulled away, offering them one last tearful smile before turning and walking down the long path away from the estate. Her small figure grew smaller with each step, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the rising sun. Isaiah stood beside Simon, clutching his worn scarf tightly in his hand. His voice was firm, but his eyes glistened with tears. She'll come back, Mr. Simon. I know she will. Simon nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yes, Isaiah. I believe she will too. Above them, the sky was a brilliant blue, with soft clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. Tasha's journey had begun, but the home she was leaving behind would always be waiting for her return. The sun rose gently over the sprawling estate, casting golden rays across the dew-kissed garden. The roses glistened with droplets of morning dew, and the melodic chirping of birds filled the crisp, peaceful air. Isaiah stood by the window of his room, his pale blue eyes gazing into the distance, following the winding path lined with trees that led away from the estate and into the vast world beyond. It had been 3 weeks since Tasha left. Her absence created an unspoken void in the mansion, one that lingered especially in Isaiah's heart. Questions haunted him. Is she safe? Has she found what she was looking for? A gentle knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Simon wheeled himself into the room, a soft, hand-knitted scarf draped over his lap. Isaiah, up early again, watching the sunrise? Simon asked with a warm smile. Isaiah turned and offered a faint smile in return. I was just thinking, Mr. Simon. Simon wheeled closer and handed Isaiah the scarf. I had this made for you. Winter is coming, and I want you to stay warm. Isaiah accepted the scarf, running his fingers over its soft, knitted surface. The simple gift filled his heart with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Thank you, Mr. Simon. I'll treasure it. A few days later, Isaiah began a new chapter in his life. Simon enrolled him in a small private school nearby, a warm, inviting building painted a calming shade of cream, surrounded by leafy trees and a lively playground. Standing at the grand gate of the school, Isaiah clutched the straps of his backpack tightly. Around him, children laughed, ran, and played together. He felt like an outsider, a misplaced color in an otherwise harmonious painting. A young teacher, Miss Anna, approached him with a gentle smile. Hello, Isaiah. I'm Miss Anna, your teacher this year. Don't worry, you'll feel right at home here in no time. Isaiah nodded shyly, his pale blue eyes still wary. Miss Anna guided him into the classroom, a bright space bathed in sunlight from large windows and decorated with colorful posters and books. Class, this is Isaiah. He'll be joining us starting today. Let's all give him a warm welcome. The class greeted him in unison, but Isaiah only bowed his head slightly and walked to an empty seat near the window. He felt out of place, but at least the sunlight streaming through the glass felt familiar. In the weeks that followed, Isaiah began to adjust to school life. Slowly but surely, he started participating in class and exchanging shy smiles with a few classmates. Miss Anna was endlessly patient, and some of his peers began to reach out to him. During recess, Isaiah often sat beneath a large tree, absorbed in a book that Simon had given him. One day, a boy named Liam, with bright brown eyes and an easy smile, approached him. Isaiah, what are you reading? Liam asked curiously. Isaiah looked up and gave a small smile. A book about the sky and the stars. Liam plopped down beside him, peering over his shoulder. Do you like stargazing? Isaiah nodded. Yeah, they remind me that no matter where we are, we're all looking up at the same sky. Liam grinned and extended his hand. I'm Liam. Want to be friends? Isaiah hesitated for a moment, then shook Liam's hand. For the first time in weeks, his heart felt just a little bit lighter. Weekends brought quieter moments with Simon. They visited the city library, walked through the park, and sometimes sat by the riverbank watching the sunset. One evening, as the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and red, Simon and Isaiah sat side by side on a wooden bench overlooking the water. Isaiah, do you still think about Tasha? Simon asked softly. Isaiah's gaze dropped to the scarf wrapped around his neck. Every day, Mr. Simon. But I know she'll be okay. Tasha is strong. Simon nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Life has a way of pulling us in different directions, Isaiah. But no matter where we go, the important thing is to keep moving forward. Isaiah smiled faintly, his heart swelling with quiet determination. One crisp morning, Isaiah stood in front of the mirror in his room, the scarf Simon had given him wrapped snugly around his neck. Sunlight poured in through the window, casting warm flow of golden patterns across the floor. He stared at his reflection. A boy who had once been a fragile shadow in the cold streets now stood stronger, braver. He was no longer the trembling child hiding in alleyways. He was Isaiah, someone who had survived, who had been given a second chance, and who had a home. From downstairs, Simon's voice called up cheerfully, Isaiah, are you ready? We have a picnic planned in the garden today. Isaiah took a deep breath and smiled, for he opened the door and hurried down the grand staircase, where Simon sat waiting with a picnic basket and Liam waved excitedly from the garden. Come on, Isaiah, we're going to lose the best spot, Liam called out. Isaiah laughed, his scarf trailing behind him as he sprinted toward the garden. Max barked happily, circling around his feet. That afternoon, beneath the clear blue sky and gentle sunlight, Isaiah sat on the soft grass with Simon and Liam. They shared sandwiches, stories, and laughter. Max rolled around playfully nearby, his tail wagging in delight. Isaiah leaned back on his hands, gazing at the sky above. Clouds drifted lazily across the expanse of blue, and the sun warmed his face. Life feels really good right now, Isaiah said softly. Simon looked over at him, his face glowing with pride. That's because you're allowing yourself to feel it, Isaiah. You've come so far, and I couldn't be prouder. Isaiah smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude and contentment. Somewhere in the distance, far beyond the estate and the city limits, Tasha was on her own journey. But Isaiah knew, deep in his heart, that their paths would cross again someday. For now, he had found his place, his home, and his peace. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden as the day came to a gentle close. Above them, the sky glowed with hues of gold and pink, a promise of tomorrow and all the hope it carried. Spring had arrived in the city. Cherry blossoms bloomed in radiant shades of pink under the warm sunlight, and the endless blue sky stretched above like a peaceful canvas. In the expansive garden of Simon Grant's estate, golden rays bathed the lush green grass, glistening on the dewdrops left behind by the night. Isaiah and his dog Max ran across the lawn, their laughter echoing in the tranquil air. Simon sat nearby on his wheelchair, a warm cup of tea in his hands, his eyes following Isaiah with a look of pure affection. Tasha had not yet returned, but as the weeks passed, the ache in Isaiah's heart had slowly begun to heal. He had learned to smile again, to cherish the simple moments with those who truly cared for him. Lunch was set under the shade of a grand oak tree in the garden. A long table, draped in a white cloth, was adorned with toasted bread, fresh salads, and chilled lemonade. Inspector Morgan was there too, sitting beside Simon with a gentle smile on his weathered face. Isaiah, have you adjusted to your new life? Morgan asked kindly. Isaiah nodded, his pale blue eyes shining with contentment. I've learned so much, Mr. Morgan. School, friends, everything feels so wonderful. Simon placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder, his smile brimming with pride. You've done so well, Isaiah. You deserve all of this. Morgan set down his cup of tea carefully, his expression growing more serious. Isaiah, there's something I'd like to ask you. The city police department is starting a program to help homeless children. Kids like you used to be. They're looking for brave young people to help lead the way. You'd have the chance to make a real difference. The table fell silent. Isaiah lowered his gaze, his fingers nervously clutching the napkin on his lap. You mean I could help other kids get off the streets? Morgan nodded, his voice filled with encouragement. Yes, Isaiah, you could become an inspiration to them. You've faced some of the darkest moments life has to offer, and yet here you are, stronger and braver than ever. You could help those kids find hope, just like you did. Isaiah looked up at Simon, then back at Morgan. In his eyes, uncertainty and determination wove together in a delicate balance. That afternoon, Isaiah sat by the small pond in the garden. The still water mirrored the endless blue sky and the drifting white clouds above. Simon quietly wheeled himself over, stopping a few feet away. Isaiah, I know you have a lot on your mind. You don't need to rush into this decision. Isaiah sighed, his eyes fixed on the water's surface. Mr. Simon, I'm scared. I'm scared I'll fail. I'm scared I won't be good enough to help anyone. Simon nodded, his voice steady and warm. Fear is normal, son, but tell me, how many times have you already overcome fear? You stood up against darkness, you saved my life, and most importantly, you dared to believe in a better tomorrow. Isaiah lifted his head, his pale blue eyes glistening with unshed tears. But what if I can't help anyone? What if I fail them? Simon smiled, his eyes filled with compassion. Isaiah, you can't control every outcome, but what matters is that you tried your best, and no matter what happens, you'll always be one of the bravest people I've ever known. A soft breeze rustled through the leaves, and Isaiah took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing. Slowly, a small smile formed on his lips. I think, I think I'll try. I want to help other kids, Mr. Simon. Simon's face lit up with pride, his smile warm and genuine. I believe in you, Isaiah, and wherever she is, Tasha will be proud of you too. A week later, Isaiah began his journey with the city's homeless youth outreach program. Every weekend, he visited a small shelter tucked away in an older part of town. The modest building stood as a refuge for children with tangled hair and worn out clothes, their eyes carrying stories far beyond their years. Isaiah stepped into the shelter, a backpack filled with books and small toys slung over his shoulder. A small blond haired boy looked up at him, his wary eyes studying Isaiah. Who are you? The boy asked cautiously. Isaiah knelt down to meet the boy's eye level, his voice soft but steady. I'm Isaiah. I used to be just like you, cold, hungry, and scared on the streets. But then someone gave me hope, and I believe you'll find hope too. The boy blinked, hesitating before nodding slightly. Slowly, other children began to approach, curiosity replacing fear in their eyes. That afternoon, Isaiah sat among them, telling his story, one of courage, trust, and love. Little by little, the fear in their eyes softened, and faint smiles began to bloom on their faces. One evening, as Isaiah sat in his room reading, there was a knock at the door. Simon entered, holding a small envelope in his hand. Isaiah, this arrived for you. It's from Tasha. Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest as he took the letter. With trembling hands, he unfolded the paper and read Tasha's familiar handwriting. Dear Isaiah, I'm okay. I've found some clues about my family and I'm still following them, but I miss you so much. Please live well and never stop believing in yourself. One day I'll come back and we'll meet again on a new path. With love, Tasha. Tears slipped down Isaiah's cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of relief, of hope. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Isaiah stood on the balcony, Tasha's letter clutched in one hand and his scarf wrapped snugly around his neck. Behind him, Simon watched with pride shining in his eyes. I'll do my best, Mr. Simon. I believe I can. Simon nodded, his smile soft and knowing. And I believe in you, Isaiah. In the distance, the city lights began to twinkle like scattered stars on the horizon. Isaiah closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the cool breeze brush against his face. When he opened them again, his gaze was fixed forward, toward the future, toward hope, and toward the countless lives he would touch. Above, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, as if they too believed in the boy who once found light in the darkest of nights. The gentle dawn bathed the city in hues of soft gold, carrying with it the refreshing breath of spring. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shimmering patterns across the lush green garden of Simon Grant's estate. Birds chirped merrily, their songs weaving into the tranquil morning air, while cherry blossoms scattered delicate pink petals across the ground. Isaiah stood on the stone steps of the grand estate, the scarf Simon had given him wrapped snugly around his neck. He looked older now, more mature than the frail, trembling boy he had once been. In his hand was a letter from Tasha, and in his eyes was a spark of hope. Simon wheeled himself to the doorway, his gentle smile lighting up his face as he looked at Isaiah. Son, today is an important day. Are you ready? Isaiah turned around, his pale blue eyes shining with determination. I'm ready, Mr. Simon. I think it's time. Simon nodded, his gaze filled with pride. Isaiah stepped into his room one last time before his departure. The small space was flooded with sunlight, its warmth soaking into every corner. The bed was neatly made, the books on the shelf carefully arranged, and the worn-out scarf from his past lay folded on his pillow. He sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers grazing over the familiar fabric of the old scarf, an emblem of the hardship he had overcome and a reminder of the strength that had carried him through. Thank you for being with me through everything, he whispered softly. Folding the scarf, he tucked it into his backpack alongside a few other keepsakes, then turned and walked out of the room. Simon waited in the hallway, his presence a comforting anchor. Isaiah, you're ready to move forward now. Don't be afraid because you'll never be alone. Isaiah bowed his head slightly, his voice steady despite the shimmer in his eyes. I won't let you down, Mr. Simon. The black car rolled slowly out of the estate gates, carrying Isaiah toward the city and the new chapter awaiting him. Simon sat on the porch, watching the vehicle until it disappeared from sight. His chest swelled with pride and a hint of bittersweet sorrow. In the car, Isaiah gazed out the window, watching the bustling streets pass by. Small shops lined the sidewalks, children laughed and played on street corners, and adults hurried to their destinations. When the car stopped in front of a modest building with a bright sign that read Hope Center, Isaiah took a deep breath before stepping out. A middle-aged woman with curly hair and a warm smile approached him. Welcome, Isaiah. I'm Eleanor, the director of this center. We're so glad you decided to join us. Isaiah bowed his head respectfully, his voice firm but nervous. I'll do my best, Mrs. Eleanor. The Hope Center wasn't large, but it was filled with warmth and life. Colorful drawings decorated the walls, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls. Isaiah entered a large room where about 10 children were scattered around, playing games, drawing, or sitting quietly in corners. A small boy with wide eyes and tousled blonde hair ran up to Isaiah. Who are you? Why are you here? Isaiah knelt down to meet the boy's eye level, offering a gentle smile. I'm Isaiah. I used to be like you, lost, scared, with nowhere to go, but someone gave me hope, and I believe you'll find it too. The boy stared at him for a moment. Seitos then nodded slightly. Slowly, the other children began to gather around Isaiah, curiosity and trust replacing their earlier caution. From across the room, Eleanor watched with a warm smile. You're doing wonderfully, Isaiah. These children need someone like you, someone who truly understands them. That evening, as the moon rose high above the city, Isaiah sat in his small room at the Hope Center. He reached into his backpack and pulled out Tasha's letter. Carefully, he unfolded it and read her words once more. Isaiah, I believe we all have our own paths to follow, but I also believe that one day our paths will cross again. Live well, stay strong, and never stop believing in yourself. Tasha. Isaiah smiled softly and tucked the letter into a journal on his nightstand. He stepped out onto the balcony, looking up at the sky where countless stars twinkled brightly against the velvet darkness. Months passed, and the Hope Center grew livelier with each day. Isaiah became an integral part of its heartbeat. He helped children learn to read, shared stories of courage and resilience, and most importantly, he listened, offering them the understanding compassion he had once longed for. One afternoon, as the sky turned golden with the setting sun, Isaiah stood by the window, watching the children play outside. Their laughter carried through the air, mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eleanor approached quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Isaiah, you've done something truly incredible here. You didn't just help these children, you gave them hope, and that's more valuable than anything else. Isaiah turned to her with a smile, his eyes reflecting a deep sense of purpose. I'm just doing what I can, Mrs. Eleanor. I want these kids to know that their past doesn't have to define their future. Outside, a child's delighted laughter echoed as a colorful kite soared high into the sky. Isaiah watched it fly higher and higher, a symbol of freedom and boundless hope. That night, under a sky dotted with stars, Isaiah sat at his desk and wrote a letter to Tasha. Dear Tasha, this place has become my home, and I'm doing something I believe in. I hope you found what you were looking for, and that wherever you are, you're safe and happy. One day, I know we'll meet again on a new path. Take care, my friend. Isaiah. Folding the letter carefully, he placed it in his journal and closed his eyes, letting the cool night breeze wash over him. The city lights sparkled in the distance like scattered stars on the horizon. Isaiah stood on the balcony, the wind gently tugging at his scarf. Above him, the stars shimmered brightly, as if cheering him on. I'll keep moving forward, Mr. Simon. I'll keep helping others, and one day Tasha and I will meet again. Far away, in some unknown place, Tasha might have been looking at the same sky under the same stars with the same hope in her heart. A chapter had closed, but the story was far from over. As the stars shone brightly above and the world continued to turn, Isaiah's journey carried on, one filled with hope, purpose, and endless possibilities.